Hi, listeners. This is the 80,000 Hours podcast, where we have unusually in-depth conversations about the world's most pressing problems, what you can do to solve them, and what to do if you're handcuffed to someone on the side of a cliff. I'm Rob Wiblin, head of research at 80,000 Hours. Recent events have had people thinking a lot more than usual about interstate conflict, which made it a no-brainer to interview economist Chris Blattman about his new book, Why We Fight. I followed Chris on his blog for many years, and I imagine quite a few of you listeners out there have read at least some of his work before. Why We Fight gives a really lovely overview of the academic theory that exists about when and why people choose violence, which is a super important topic that we've unfortunately never really covered on the show before. Before we get to that, I've just got two quick notices. First, at 80,000hours.org/latest, you'll find a new, very informative article titled My Experience with Imposter Syndrome and How to Partly Overcome It, written by previous guest of the show, Luisa Rodriguez. If that topic sounds interesting to you at all, I recommend going and checking it out. Second, on the website, you'll also find that we are hiring a new full-time staff writer to publish, hopefully, well-researched articles that help people use their careers to contribute to solving the world's most pressing problems. That would mean you'd be working with Luisa Rodriguez and previous host of the show, Arden Kayla, among several others. The starting salary for someone with 1 year of relevant experience would be about £61,000 a year. And ideally, you would be able to live in London, although we are also open to people working remotely as well. Applications for that close in a couple of weeks on the 16th of May, and you can learn more about the role and apply if it sounds interesting to you at 80,000hours.org/latest. All right, without further ado, I bring you Chris Blattman. Today, I'm speaking with Christopher Blattman, the Ramali Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago. Chris is an economist and political scientist who has spent years studying the causes of violence in contexts as diverse as a civil war in northern Uganda, generalized insecurity in post-Civil War Liberia, and gang violence in the city of Medellín in Colombia. That led him to write his new book, Why We Fight, The Roots of War and the Paths to Peace, which is going to be the focus of today's conversation. We probably won't get to all of this today, but listeners may also be interested to know that Chris has gone out and coordinated randomized trials looking at the impact of cash transfers, which he is an advocate of. And he's also studied the impact of so-called sweatshop jobs in Ethiopia, which he became more pessimistic about after conducting a trial to see how they really affected workers' income and health. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
I hope to talk about what causes intergroup violence and how circumstances can be shifted to make turn to violence less appealing. But first, what are you working on at the moment, and why do you think it's important?
So, I've just started dipping my toe into working in Mexico. One reason is there's a lot of violence there. I don't think it's quite studied enough. And so and it's obviously super important. It might be one of the biggest national security issues for the US, and there's a lot of people harmed. But mostly from all my international peace building work or research, I just see a lot of techniques that are used, like mediation between armed groups, that just never get deployed, it seems, in U.S. cities. It happens very little in Chicago. It's kind of a natural thing to try to mediate between warring factions. We don't do it. Some of that does happen in Mexico, and so that's a good example of ways in which I think Mexico is maybe at the frontier of incorporating a lot of these lessons from international peace building into countering violence, and we could learn from that and maybe see that spread.
Yeah, is there a reason why this isn't used in US cities? Is this kind of the classic thing that the US tends to be unusually reluctant to learn from studies overseas?
Well, it's not just the US, it's in the other parts of the Americas as well. It's done a bit in Colombia, in Medellín, where I work, but I think one reason is I think we just have a blind spot to some degree. There's an instinct that this is just a more individualized problem, and that this policing is the solution, and part policing is essential, but we can also do other things. I think the more legitimate thing that governments have to take a lot of care with is they have to be careful not to sort of legitimize these groups too much. So I think what you actually need are more civil society actors to step up and try to mediate, and that happens a little bit. I've followed a few people who do this in Chicago, but they're very few. They're hard to find. It's not very systematic. It's ad hoc. They do it in their spare time. They could be an ex-gang leader. They could be a social worker. They could be a minister. And they don't have any particular skill or experience, other than whatever they've acquired. And they haven't had a chance to learn or share experiences with many other people. So it's very ad hoc at the moment. So I think that should probably change.
Yeah, I think we'll get to some of those stories about kind of mediated peace between criminal groups later on. But let's dive right into your book, Why We Fight. Yeah, in that book, which is probably going to be out by the time this interview airs, you aim to get people to think a bit more clearly about why it is that violence sometimes occurs and how it is that it can be prevented. I think you really succeed on that count. And in a sense, what you're saying is really straightforward and just fundamental, but it's kind of wisdom and modeling that's, I think, is often really missing from discussions of violence and would add a lot of value. I should note for listeners at the outset, one thing you're clear that you're not doing is setting out to analyze individual or kind of heat of the moment violence in the book, because the causes of that are a bit more idiosyncratic and personal and probably better left to psychologists than political scientists potentially. But that is fine with me, because kind of my personal interests here are primarily about how to prevent major wars between states, because they're most likely to be the risk factor for the collapse of civilization or human extinction.
Right.
Anyway, with that out of the way, first off, a lot of people have the perception that humanity is beset by violence. And if you watch the news, it might indeed seem that way. But you argued that, in fact, doing violence to others absorbs very little direct human effort. Is there a way of quantifying kind of what fraction of all human resources are directed towards physical violence?
That's a good question. Not that I know of is the short answer. I mean, I think, but you know what we don't even do related to this idea that actually war is kind of rare or the exception rather than the rule, is that we tend to overestimate how much conflict there is and also how much effort's devoted to non-violent negotiation, bargaining, posturing, all these sorts of things that we do. So we forget, we pay attention to the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine, which we should, just like a doctor should pay attention to the very sick people. But then we sort of overlook the fact that there wasn't a war for them to sort of basically almost subsume or cow Belarus or send peacekeepers into Kazakhstan or Georgia, and the list goes on and on and on. So most of the time, these things are not settled. They're settled acrimoniously, but without violence.
Yeah, I was thinking about how to answer this question. I guess you have, I think something like 3 or 4%, I think, of global GDP is spent on militaries directly. The interesting thing is that we spend all of this money actually training soldiers and buying all of this equipment and so on. And yet 99% of the time, the soldiers are just sitting there, not engaged in any actual war at all.
Right.
So the thing that we're not saying is that people won't buy armaments. The thing that your modeling implies is that they'll rarely actually be used.
I mean, this is, I think, one of the big insights just from strategic analysis or game theory in general, which is that most of the time fighting doesn't happen because it's really inefficient and there's a better way to obtain that. But the big inefficient thing that does happen is arming, right? That unless we can find a way to commit really solidly to commit one another to disarm, that we're just going to invest an enormous amount of social resources in that. And that's really hard to avoid. I mean, I think that's what, when we do have states, when we do have alliances, that partly solves the problem. So, you think about the Western Hemisphere. We have the United States. We have all of these countries in the Western Hemisphere, which are all sort of in an alliance with the United States. The U.S. is like the hegemon, and it helps keep the peace. And as a result, none of these nations really need to arm against one another. And so that hegemonic sort of power and that sort of set of agreements, and also their collective willingness to act, means that we don't have to worry about going to war against one another. And so everybody can disarm against those. But then we still have to arm against the possibility of an invasion from some other hegemonic alliance led by Russia or China. So we do have solutions to this, right? But there's still partial solutions.
Yeah, what's the basic model that people should always keep in mind for why it is that violence should be expected to be really rare?
Yeah, I mean, this is the book is really my attempt to distill insights, my own, but mostly these insights from decades of researchers in psychology and game theory. The core one, starts with people like Thomas Schelling and James Fearon, a whole host of economists and legal scholars as well who studied strikes and courts, because we're all talking about the same thing, which is there are things like warring, court battles, labor strikes that are inherently costly that we can negotiate to avoid, so we can either bargain or fight. Right. And war is just politics by other means, in the words of many, many famous generals, including von Clausewitz. And so that's what we have to remember, that this is a choice, and one of them is incredibly more costly than the other. So we can almost always find a negotiated settlement, whether we're officially negotiating or we're just posturing from afar, right? We can always find something that makes us better off than fighting and flipping a coin to see who gets what we're fighting over. And so that's the starting point. And so the costs of war is the gravitational pull towards peace.
Yeah.
That keeps us in that orbit.
Right. Yeah, I guess applying this to the current case that is going to be on people's minds a lot, the Russia-Ukraine invasion. I mean, if you think it's like been so costly for Russia and it's been so costly for Ukraine that it is remarkable that they couldn't reach a negotiated settlement that would be better for both parties than the absolute shit show that they're living through.
I mean, that's what we do. We just have to approach it like that. Has to be our first instinct, that it is remarkable because it shouldn't happen. And I predicted it wouldn't happen. I mean, only because I think that's always the best bet. I was wrong. And so we, in every one of these cases, we then have to say, okay, well then some other thing must have had such an incredible pull that it overcame those costs and yanked us out of that peaceful orbit. And then the search for those causes begins.
Right. Yeah. So you offer 5 different explanations for how it is that despite the enormous costs that are involved in violence, nonetheless, states can end up using it, or I guess, and also like smaller groups can end up using violence. I guess if I had to really distill down why is it that violence is rarely used, it's because I would say that when there's an imbalance of power, like the weaker party basically gives up. They don't surrender completely. They don't give up everything, but they give up most of what the more powerful party wants.
Yep.
They appease them effectively, and so they don't lose a fight, but they've lost like part of what they wanted because the other side was just more powerful than them.
Right. We all get what we deserve. In where deserve is not maybe some abstract notion of quality of justice in this. I mean, it would be nice, but where what we deserve is what we have the military or other power to sort of demand. And if we're weak, if we don't, if we can't threaten to burn the house down, well, we're not going to get the house.
Yeah. I mean, people often object to making concessions to bullies who want unreasonable things on the basis that it's appeasement, and that's meant to be really bad.
Right.
And I think the thing that I always just want to remind people is that like appeasement makes the world go round, or appeasement is the thing that has prevented war from being a constant feature of just like a more constant feature of human life from the very beginning.
Right. Appeasement is what we call compromise when we find the compromise repugnant.
Yeah.
It's just a synonym.
Yeah. You have this great story of compromise that prevented a conflict that could have broken out between gangs on the streets of this city, Medellín, in Colombia. Yeah, can you briefly describe that, how that situation played out?
Sure. So this was, we've been interviewing criminal leaders in prison and increasing out of prison to understand how this whole apparatus works. And one of the people we interviewed in Bella Vista prison was telling us a story that I later like to call the billiards war, because it begins over a game of billiards. In his cell block, there were 2 rival factions that were gangs on the street, and a lot of their membership was on the cell block. And they were in the game room, they were playing billiards, and he doesn't remember what happened, but maybe it was just a petty dispute or something. One side pulls out their guns and shoots on the other. And why they have guns is a whole other podcast. But when the dust settles, miraculously no one's killed. And of course, immediately the other side prepares for retaliatory attacks. Everybody arms. There is the system, there are many gangs. There's a system of alliances. They all activate their alliances. Everybody starts to arm. Is this the next big war in Medellín? Because there have been big gang wars 2 or 3 times in the past. And there is a cycle of retaliatory killings and things start to escalate. And then it doesn't. The billiard wars never happens mainly because it's not in their interests. Also because there are these higher powers in Medellín, organizations that are called bandas or razones, and they themselves have a negotiating table. It's a little bit like the UN Security Council. It's not that effective, not that equal, but it kind of works some of the time. And they sit these 2 gangs down and are like, no, we're all going to lose too much if you guys fight. And we're not going to sell our drugs, and you're going to get us embroiled in a war. And so we're going to disincentivize you. We're going to make you pay attention to the costs of war that you will inflict on everyone. And that's one of the reasons. And that's versions of that have happened many, many times. And that's one reason why, despite sort of being this valley filled with hot-headed young men and lots and lots of guns and armed groups, has a homicide rate half of that of Chicago.
Yeah. I mean, an interesting thing is that, so there's kind of tiny gangs that occupy individual blocks, and then those are kind of aggregated into these larger gangs that oversee a whole lot of kind of block level organizations.
It's a super common political form, both for gangs, but also internationally. Like I just remember I described America, the hegemon, keeping the peace with its own countries in the Western Hemisphere so that they don't have to fight with one another. It's kind of the same system of these, whatever that, political scientists would call hegemonic alliances. Like it's the big guy keeps the peace within their neighboring gangs. And then It's an easier negotiation problem between two hegemons than between,
100 small
300, 400. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so the leaders of these higher level gangs are all together in a cell block, or they're placed together in a cell block because they're all in prison. And so
there are many cell blocks. There's a leader's wing in every prison. And so there's many prisons around, and all of them have a leader's wing. And so many of them are together. They're spread out across many leaders' wings. What's interesting, this is not, we've only gotten these accounts from the criminal side. We have not yet to sort of get someone from the government on the record. But there was a brewing conflict at one point where they were going to war. Again, this is actually much more recently than the billiards war that didn't happen. Homicide rate had tripled in the city because these factions were actually starting to squabble and skirmish, and maybe it was going to turn into all-out war. And then all of a sudden, one day, all of these leaders and all these prisons get transferred to new prisons. They're just going to move people around. But in order to do that, everybody has to go to the same cell block and actually be in the same place for 3 days before they all get moved around. And somebody gets arrested who's kind of a well-known mediator on the criminal side. He's a crook. And miraculously, he happens to land in the same cell block, right? So it's all one grand coincidence. And a week later, the homicide rate has, gone back down to its like a third of what it was, and back down to its normal level. So you can prison, state repression, the threat of state repression and prison can actually be, and often is, a mechanism for peace building, but also criminal control in a lot of cities in the Americas.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, I imagine that the thing that motivated them all to have these extended discussions in the prison and come up with some sort of peace arrangement is that it would be atrocious for business to go to war. I mean, the government will crack down on them. Yeah. They can't sell as many drugs when people won't come and visit them because they're worried about getting shot. It's just like, it's very financially costly to them. And ultimately, this organized crime is a business for them.
Right. And the government can also threaten to make a lot of the leaders are in prison, and the government can threaten to make their lives easier or harder.
Yeah. So there is kind of a hegemon.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's trying, Medellín, this whole system works out much more peacefully than in most big cities. They're sort of at the tail end of really having, and the state has managed to coordinate in this way without, I think, being co-opted or doing anything that I think is really distasteful. I think they've really managed to walk this line incredibly well of shrinking and reducing the strength of the groups as much as they can, but still acknowledging that they're pretty powerful and realizing that they have to negotiate in a way, but negotiating in a really one-sided ultimatum-like way that isn't sort of legitimizing them as political actors. It's a really complicated problem to solve if you're a government, and Colombia's done it pretty well.
So yeah, I was thinking about this model of how even groups that potentially don't like one another. I don't know how these gang leaders get on. They might have some affection for one another in a sense because they're in the same industry, but there might also be a lot of bad blood from past events that cause them to personally dislike one another.
Yeah,
obviously. So me and my rivals don't generally engage in shooting wars on the streets, but I think all of us are subject to kind of a similar set of incentives here when it comes to interpersonal conflicts in social situations, or when it comes to people who we don't like in a professional environment. So I think the closest equivalent to war in my life would be kind of disputes and spats in public on Twitter and things like that, where there's people who don't like me and there's people who I don't respect, who I think are really wrong, or like maybe I think their projects are bad, and on some level I would like to criticize them. But if we get into a shooting war where we're both talking in public about how much we detest the other one and why,
right?
Of course, it's a cycle of retaliation in which both of us incredibly lose in terms of reputation. And at the end of the day, like, what really is likely to be gained? It's not obvious that either of which party is going to win the PR battle on this going into start. And so even people who really detest one another tend to just loathe one another in peace rather than engage in a public fights.
Right. I mean, we no longer, if someone insults you on Twitter, you no longer challenge them to a duel to the death, right? That's and so that's eroded for good reason, because that's not really an optimal. Now, those used to happen, and so that gets us down the road of like why violence does happen, but it's kind of obvious. Most people sort of look at dueling and say, yeah, that's not a good decision.
Yeah.
And they're right. It's the same logic.
Yeah. I guess, to be honest, when people insult me on Twitter these days, I don't even reply because usually 95% of the time I have the self-control to not reply because it seems negative.
Right. Absolutely.
I guess that's the culture of dignity that we have. Can you lay out the analogy between war and human health that you have in the book?
Right. So I mean, I think of it in a couple ways. So one is that listen, we all know that most people are healthy, and we would want doctors to get trained in the healthy functioning of the human body and not forget, and by virtue of being surrounded by sick people all the time, not forget that healthy people exist. And unfortunately, we're in a world of war doctors, right? People who are trying to sort of figure out and operate in these conflicts that somehow forget that there's this normal healthy state and that's the default, and that's actually the disease is rare. So that's like a first mistake we have to get past, that many do, but not all. But then once we're there, the funny thing about just a lot of violence reduction, I see this in the city of Chicago. I see this in West African civil wars. There's often like a whole bunch of one size fits all solutions, right? So, this city used violence interrupters, so we must need violence interrupters. Or this study used this new policing, hotspots policing, or focused deterrent, or some policing tactic, and that worked there, so we need to import that. You see that a lot in U.S. cities. The other thing you see the same thing, and there's like a package. There's this like humanitarian peacekeeping complex in Africa that says, okay, first we need a DDR program. First we need mediators. Then we need a demobilization and disarmament and reintegration program, DDR. Now we need a peacekeeping mission. Now we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there's like this package. And now we need like elections within 2 years of the conflict. And you're going to get it whether you like it or not. And if our doctor did that, if we just showed up the doctor and said, I'm kind of sick, and he's like, you know what you need? Radiation therapy. And you'd be like, whoa. Like, I didn't even tell you what was wrong with me. You didn't even spend any time thinking about it. Like, what is going on? There's this thing called diagnosis, but of course it happens because how do you solve the disease if you don't have the diagnosis? And somehow we forget that. And we just think, it's violence. It's, we need, this again, just like South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's bonkers, but it's super common.
Yeah, I think another analogy to health that I find that I kind of have to constantly remind myself not to miss is that so death is rarely caused by a single malady, a single problem.
Right.
It's like, someone who's 85 dies of pneumonia nominally.
Right.
But in fact, they've died of so many different things that weakened the system until it was the point that a viral infection could actually kill them. And so it is with conflict situations where, there was some fight between two, there was the fight in the bar that started the war. But actually, that's just the last straw. And what's really going on is like, why was the patient so incredibly sick that could spread?
Exactly. I mean, I think I used the example of like the First World War in my book, where I talk about most people think, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and that plus this sort of the miscalculations of Europe's mediocre leaders, sleptwalked the whole continent and the world into war. And that's true in the same sense that pneumonia killed, an 85-year-old person. But the only reason that person was so vulnerable, and the only reason we're so vulnerable to some wacky little idiosyncratic situation or leader miscalculation was because all the fundamentals were so fragile. But, those fundamentals are less apparent, I think, at least less readily apparent. So I'm not blaming, it takes ages for people to figure these out after the fact. And it's often hard to see in real time. So I have the luxury of summarizing thousands of people who have thought deeply about it for a century. So it sounds, so of course that's going to sound wise, but that's sort of like the slow lesson that I think a whole legion of social scientists have learned.
Yeah. It's interesting that, so in the World War I case, where the temptation is to say, well, World War I was on some level caused by an assassination, the way that we instinctively check that is to think, well, what fraction of wars were preceded by an assassination? And that is like moderately common. But we also need to think what fraction of assassinations are followed by a war? And that is actually quite uncommon. We need to look for disconfirming cases as well. And that is something that I, like, even knowing this for many years, I find it so counterintuitive.
There were several Balkan wars just in the few years before World War I that did not trigger World War I. There were innumerable crises that were very similar in the 20 years previous that didn't cause World War I then. So something else was going on.
Yeah. What are some things that people think lead to violence or, are underlying causes of violence and wars that you are more skeptical of?
Yeah. I mean, right away you talked about how I'm not talking about interpersonal violence, even though actually that's my day job. A lot of it is actually studying and developing programs to counter interpersonal violence. And I do think like human emotions and passions in these hot reactive moments that do explain a lot of violence are really central to understanding a lot of interpersonal violence. And not just that, it's my relationship with my 9-year-old son and whatever, and whether we argue with our boss or our wife or whatever is really important. And I think It's not that it's irrelevant when it comes to big groups. I just think it's far from the whole set of all of our human errors and foibles and frailties. It's probably the least of them because it gets mediated by big bureaucracies. Because
fades over time.
It fades over time, and it's maybe some monarch getting angry in July or August 1914 helped contribute to World War I. But by 1917, presumably hot-headed reactive violence and passions were not what was going on.
Yeah.
So that's a good example of one that I think is maybe overstated. We tend to take our interpersonal violence and then we project that onto nations, and I don't think that's a good guide.
Yeah, when I read that part of the book, I was trying to think, why would it be that people are biased towards thinking about these kind of personal emotions as a driver of large-scale conflict? And two things jump to mind. One is that, the thing that we have experience of all the time is interpersonal interactions, like our interactions with our spouse, our interactions with our boss,
yes,
where these personal feelings are more key. And so we're building this analogy up to a much bigger scale.
And that is to me a version of the availability bias of that's what we take what's available and we think that's more common. And also our tendency, what I call projection bias, is we then project that onto other situations, maybe erroneously. So what it is we actually form and hold strenuously onto erroneous beliefs despite contrary evidence. And that, not the passions, it's our ability to sort of draw the wrong conclusion from incomplete information and then project it to other people and situations. That is the misperception. That's one of the things. That's one of these causes of war. It's these biases to have persistently erroneous beliefs that really matter in group behavior and individual behavior, and the passions fade away. So I want to push us towards focusing on the mistakes bureaucracies and military generals and accountable presidents make all the time, not the ones that get filtered out.
Yeah. I think the other big contributor for why it's natural to reach for these personal explanations is that it's something that you can do without having a lot of very specific, detailed knowledge about the strategic situation. Yeah. So in the case of Russia-Ukraine, in order to think about this in a systematic or strategic way, you would probably want to know, what is the Donbass? Where is the line between Ukraine and Russian control? The Minsk Accords, what was in them? And to what degree were they agreed? What is Zelensky's policy towards Russia? All things that I don't really know that much about now, and I certainly didn't know much about in January.
Yeah.
But of course, I can always reach, without knowing any context about the specific case, I can always say, oh, it's because of Putin's personality. That's an easy thing to say.
Yeah, I think and it's easy to understand. That too is a little bit of the availability heuristic going on. But yeah, I think it permeates everything we do.
Yeah. Some other drivers of war that I hear people talk about that you're kind of skeptical of include climate change and water scarcity. Mm-hmm. Yeah, can you talk about why it is that you're skeptical of this idea of water wars?
So I think, scarce water, any scarce resource is something which we're going to compete over. Right? If there's a little bit, we'll compete over it. If there's a lot of it, we will still probably find a way to compete over it. And the competition is still going to be costly. And so we're always going to strenuously compete. It'll be hostile. It'll be bitter, but it shouldn't be violent. And the fact that water becomes more scarce, sort of like any resource becomes more scarce, doesn't take away from the fact that it's still costly to fight over it. And so there's always room for that deal. So the fact that our water is shrinking in some places, we have to be skeptical. And so what is actually causing this? And then empirically, I think when people take a good look at this and they actually look at all these counterfactual cases where there's water and it didn't break it, we just don't see that. I think water scarcity is a persistent driver of war. The same is a little bit true of climate change, but where the theory is sort of the same. It's not clear why things getting hotter or colder how it affects interpersonal violence is pretty clear. But why it should affect sustained years-long warfare is far less clear. That said, unlike water wars, the empirical evidence is a little bit stronger that something's going on. But to me, it's just then a bit of a puzzle that still needs to be sorted out. Because once again, the fact that we're getting jostled by unexpected temperature shocks, unexpected weather events, it's not clear why that should lead to sustained political competition through violence rather than finding some bargain solution.
Yeah, I remember when I first heard this idea of water wars, and some like alarm bell went off in my head, and I've kind of been skeptical of it from the beginning. And I think one trigger that sets off is, okay, so water will be more scarce in some places in the future than it is now. Fair enough. But lots of resources are scarce now, and water is scarce in some places now. So why aren't people fighting wars all the time about all of the things that are already scarce, including in some cases water? I mean, occasionally they do, but mostly they don't. And it's presumably because violence is incredibly costly, and an agreement is better, and that will remain true in future.
Right. I think you said it better than me.
Another thing that people think drives violence is having men in power rather than women. The evidence on that is a little bit mixed. It's kind of an interesting picture. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, it's more like it's more of a complex. And so there's this instinct that we see, like men are obviously more aggressive in interpersonal violence. Most of the soldiers are men. Most of the war leaders and generals are men. So it's totally natural to try to extrapolate from individual aggression to group aggression. But it's sort of like the passions. Like, I think aggression is just one of these emotions that I think gets filtered out in longer groups over long periods of time and long fights. And so it's not surprising to me that when people actually compare the likelihood of going to war with male or female leaders, that they're just as likely to go to war with one another. And when people have found clever natural experiments in current times or history, when it was quasi-randomly a woman leader or male leader, they too are not necessarily much more likely to go to war. So that may not matter very much. Now, people could retort, and they should, and they could, to say, well, these are just women leaders. This is not actually like an integrated government and maybe that would be different. We don't really have 50% or half, women represented to their proportion of the population in almost anywhere in history. So it's not the fair empirical comparison. But I think this theory is strong that we shouldn't expect this individual aggression to become dominant. But I absolutely think that enfranchising women is going to make people more powerful. It sort of comes to, we talked about what anything that causes war is going to be something that helps you overlook costs. And one big category of that is if a leader is an autocrat. In the extreme, a leader is an autocrat, bears very few of the costs. You have an unchecked leader, bears very few of those costs. Why would they consider them in that calculation? They're going to be far too ready to use violence. They may even have a private incentive, something that benefits them, not others, not their group, to go to war. Well, now let's think about a democratic leader where only half of the population gets to vote for them. Maybe it's only men, which of course has been true in many times and places. Maybe it's only one ethnic group or only one religious group. Well, there's half that population is going to be ignored. Their interests, the cost of war that they bear is going to be ignored. And so the leader is going to be far too ready to use violence and far more vulnerable to other failures and breakdowns that lead the group into war. And so anything that makes them more accountable to a wider swath of the people, including women, irrespective of whether they are more or less likely to support violence in surveys or something, is just going to make the world more peaceful. And so that's like the first order thing we should be thinking about.
Yeah, in part of the book, you suggested that poverty probably doesn't increase war initiation, just for the obvious reason that just because you're poorer or just because there's less stuff to go around doesn't make it more appealing to fight versus reach an agreement.
Right. The same argument with the water scarcity.
Right, exactly.
The scarcity of other things.
But you thought it could lead to prolonging wars or more escalated wars. And the argument was poverty reduces incomes for non-violent occupations. You might be like, leave the farm because the weather's terrible and go get a military job as well. But I was thinking, doesn't that reduce incomes from violent occupations basically by the same amount? So, in a poor country, if your side wins the war, then there's less GDP to steal. And at the same time, if the economy's doing badly, then so you grab less by winning, and there's less tax revenue to go around to pay your salary as a soldier. So you might think that this effect kind of cancels out.
It could cancel out, and that might be why I don't think the effect is super strong in the data. But often the people fighting and the people leading those who are fighting are able to capture most of these, whatever revenues and resources there are able to capture those, and they make sure that the people with guns get paid first. And so I do think there's this fact that the gains and the assets in society will not be equally distributed in that context. And so that's probably what's going on in these cases. But I agree. I mean, I just think the relationship between poverty or sudden adverse shocks to income and violence in general are not particularly strong in any circumstance. It's only in this one circumstance where they do seem to play some role.
Yeah, I suspect that people really overestimate the causal channel from poverty to conflict because we observe a strong correlation, but it's because the causal chain is more often the other way that conflict leads to poverty, and you kind of can't easily observe which one came first.
Right. And then economists, which is the other hat I wear, like to, finding natural experiments with changes in income is actually a lot easier than finding changes in a lot of other factors that I think do drive conflict. Because you can measure commodity prices and you can measure a temperature shock and you can measure whether or not rainfall changed and destroyed your crops. And so we tend to just write a lot of studies about how poverty and economic shocks affect conflict because we can. And then we don't write studies about the things that are hard to measure, that the causes are a little harder to pin down. And so we tend to obsess, and then we make a lot out of some statistically significant correlation that maybe isn't actually that even close to important. And only applies to some cases because it's the thing we can measure. And I think that's been a blind spot in research over the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. When I try to think about what is causing a specific conflict and what might be able to help to cause it to stop, I try to put myself in this odd headspace where I mentally set aside which side is right, which side is just and which side is unjust. Because I think on that kind of positive question, I guess this is what economists call it, positive rather than normative, merely descriptive question of what would cause it to stop and what caused it to start. The question of who is right and wrong actually just doesn't really affect that at all. And at the same time, having those normative facts in mind, who do you agree with and who do you disagree with, can kind of strongly cloud our judgment on these non-normative questions. Is that something that you also try to do?
I mean, 100%. In fact, I think I do it too naturally now and too well in the sense that I think I've realized in talking about the contemporary conflicts where passions run high and people have my dispassionate discussion and find people get very upset at.
Yeah.
But I always have my own private views. And so it's this hard thing. I think to be a good social scientist and to actually analyze things clearly, you have to do that. But more importantly, I think you have to do that even if you are the general on one side or the other. They call it strategic empathy. You need to try to understand the conflict from the point of view of your enemy in a very clear-headed way, partly to avoid these kinds of availability and projection biases and other misperceptions that will just lead you to make strategic errors.
All right, let's now go through the 5 causes of war that you lay out in the book. I think this is the most important thing for listeners to remember. Hopefully many of you will go away and read the book and get all of the details. And then hopefully these 5 causes will stick in your mind. But if you don't, this is a really important section to keep in mind. And so we'll try to give specific names to these 5 different phenomena, these 5 different drivers. The first one that you lay out, you call unchecked interests. And that's basically where there's a divergence in interests between the people who decide to go to war and the people who experience the consequences of the war. Yeah, can you briefly explain that phenomenon?
Right. So it's a little bit like what I described in the context of women in war, which is to say, think of an autocrat, think of a Putin, for example. If the main thing that is keeping us from going to war are the costs of war, and the person who makes that decision, in this case, a personalized autocrat, doesn't have to bear the costs of everyday soldiering and death or deprivations from sanctions, some of them, right? He's bearing a lot of pain, let's make no mistake, and risk, but doesn't consider all of them. Well, that's going to really reduce the incentives for peace and make him ready to use violence. And what's worse is when the circumstances around war give those leaders a private incentive, something that benefits them to go to war, but not their group. In Liberia, certain natural resources, so not water, but diamonds, also timber, a few other goods that could be exported in this war economy, give warlords an incentive to go to war and stay at war because they can use that disorder to enrich themselves. That's a classic example. While that could be going on in a place like Russia, I think it's more likely that there's some reason for invading Ukraine, for example, that gives a private incentive. It may be a belief that this will entrench their power and solidify their political control and continue to leave them unchecked. And so that is that first logic. It's really simple. Costs of war keep us from fighting. Leaders who ignore costs because they can are more ready to fight.
Yeah, you have this nice example of how in kind of provoking the French and Indian War, which I guess then kind of blew up, although I don't know whether it was causal, but it kind of expanded into the 7 Years' War between Britain and France. And then also helping to launch the US War of Independence. George Washington actually had a lot to gain personally, and that this might have influenced his judgment. Can you explain that? Right.
So, I mean, I don't think this is the primary explanation for the American Revolution, but I think we can't ignore it because it's factor. And I wanted to use something that was counterintuitive for people. It's really easy to sort of think, oh, that Liberian warlord, of course we would never do that. And I wanted to sort of take one of the most iconically and high integrity characters in history and sort of point out that even they were somewhat unchecked. Because certainly certainly after the American Revolution was run, most Americans couldn't vote. Certainly they weren't holding George Washington and the other founding fathers fully accountable in the years running up to the revolution. And what's interesting, and many historians have noted, is that most of the founding fathers had a big economic stake in independence or a very particular, trade and tax policy with Britain. It's no coincidence. And coincidentally, a lot of the people who remained loyalists had economic stakes in union with Britain and with the British policies that the Britain wanted to impose on the United States. And so that surely influenced, along with all of the other more noble motives, that played a role both in their willingness to launch the revolution, but it also played a role. Washington was like a notorious land speculator. He was a consumer. He wanted the fanciest clothes, the fanciest carriages, the land, trappings of wealth. He pursued that his entire life. And his pursuit of that land wealth is one of the things that set off the French and Indian Wars. And so we just can't ignore it.
Yeah. So Washington, among others, was going out west trying to claim territory as his personal property, which involved taking it from the Indians and the French potentially. Mm-hmm. The British weren't necessarily keen on this because this could lead to a very expensive conflict. And I think towards the point at which they were claiming independence, the British, you said, were interested in returning some of the land that Washington had claimed for himself personally.
Right. It was a private illegal militia who had appointed a junior member of their sort of elitist clique of Virginia families to go off and seize land from the French and Indians. It was sort of like an errant splinter group that was provoking if you're from the British point of view, this like errant, selfish, materialistic splinter militia was going off and provoking the enemy unnecessarily and was going to bring everything crashing down in their own self-interest. And that's like, to some approximation, exactly what happened.
Yeah, I'll stick up a link to a really good resource on that for those who want to learn more about that story. The second cause of violence you point out is that people often get value out of war kind of above and beyond any material gains that they might achieve if they win. And you call this category intangible incentives. And I guess I might think of it as kind of violence as a terminal value or harming the other party as a terminal value. Yeah, well, what are some of those intangible incentives for armed conflict?
Yeah, this is like a really diverse category, and so I never found a label I loved, and so intangible incentives was the best of a bad bunch that I think captured. You could think of it as violence as a terminal category, but you could also think of it as violence, just the thing that you value is actually not violence, but it's something that only violence can deliver. And so glory is an example, vengeance is another example. There may be certain nationalist or ethnic or religious ideals about extending the power of your group, exterminating the heretic, exterminating the heretical view, racial purity. So these have been more or less noble, many of them less noble throughout history. And all of these stories, as different as they are, share this similar logic, which is there was something ethereal. It wasn't like the material country or territory or economy or policy space that you were battling over. There was some value that you achieved through violence, like glory, or that only violence could deliver you. But maybe the more important one, I think, for understanding a lot of conflicts, especially a lot of contemporary conflicts, which is also an intangible incentive, is that there's some ideal that we hold that we refuse to compromise on. So the Ukrainians refuse to compromise on their liberty. The American revolutionaries refuse to compromise on their liberty. And the Taliban refused to compromise, not so much on their liberty, but on a set of principles. The American administration, when dealing with the Taliban, refused to compromise on a certain set of principles of justice and of punishment of a grave crime. And so our intransigence on a principle is a kind of intangible incentive that essentially says, well, there's a bargain to be made that we should accept semi-sovereignty as an American revolutionary or as a Ukrainian, because they're strong and we're weak. And I refuse. That is the sensible compromise. War would be costly, but because I value this ethereal thing so greatly, I will fight for it, and I will not regret it afterwards. It's not a mistake. The principle
stand by
of
my
liberty,
choice.
Exactly. I stand by my choice. And that And I think that's very powerful. I think we can understand some fraction of these wars through these instances of noble or ignoble intransigence.
Yeah, there's this idea that a lot of people have heard that kind of, Enlightenment values should cause us to fight less often. But I think it's actually like very theoretically ambiguous, because Enlightenment values not only say, well, it's bad to kill a random person overseas. Yeah. It does come with that. However, it also kind of says that there's these, at least many interpretations, that there's these inviolable principles around human rights. And if that's the case, if you're just kind of not willing to make a dirty bargain with a dictator in order to maintain peace, where, you sell some strangers down the river, you allow the dictator to get away with what you regard as human rights violations, if that's not on the table because you're like too concerned with the kind of moral purity based on the values that you have based on the Enlightenment, then you might be willing to go to war more because you have values that are kind of global, universal. You care about what's happening in these other countries, where a purely self-interested country might not care at all what's happening in Rwanda, or what atrocities are occurring elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way to encapsulate something I've been writing on, just to sort of understand the product of the Enlightenment and this humanitarian revolution is both peacemaking and not. It's peacemaking because it makes us care about the other side rather than ignoring. We always care about the cost to ourselves, maybe not to the others. So any regard we have for the well-being of others is going to, and any repugnance we have for violence is going to make us less willing to fight because it's more costly. But you're right, it leads to more idealism and intransigence, potentially. And I think that's absolutely the case. And that's why I think we may see, I hate to say it, it has a little echo of this sort of Clash of Civilizations kind of story to it, which is to say different ideologies will fight. But I think it's different. It's sort of saying that this triumphant thing that at least some of the world has accomplished, which is this human rights revolution, is to the extent that we're really rights-based and some principles we will never compromise on, is going to make peace more difficult in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine that this human rights ethics approach could lead to less conflict when you have a really strong hegemon that has those values and basically cows everyone into going along with them, and everyone else is willing to accept that. But in a multipolar world, we have all sorts of different groups with what they regard as pure moral values that they're not allowed to compromise on, and they're different ones, then you should expect just like constant riven conflict, more or less.
Right. It's the tension between realpolitik, which is just the willingness to make these bitter, unequal compromises in order to preserve the peace and in the pursuit of your own self-interest, and these ideals.
Yeah. So some of these kind of these like intangible incentives that you talk about, to me, they seem downstream of a sort of game theory of conflict. So for example, having a desire to retaliate against a party that wrongs you. Yeah. It seems like you could say that's kind of an intangible incentive, like revenge is an intangible incentive. But you might also think that actually this is a game theoretical strategic thing, because in order that people not attack you in the first place, you have to credibly be able to commit to punish them, even if it's not in your interest, like narrowly after the fact. Yeah, should we put maybe some of these things in a different bucket, or think of some of them as kind of intangible incentives and other ones as strategic considerations?
Well, I mean, so I think you're absolutely right. And this is like that's the 201 level of like the argument, but this is the kind of podcast. So I would say, first of all, there's nothing about intangible incentives that isn't strategic, all right? Which is in the sense that like we value what we value. And so, if you're trying to sort of, through game theory or, just basic reasoning, sort of think about how people are going to act, you have to sort of you have to understand what they value. And so intangible incentives is just introducing a whole bunch of sort of unusual, non-standard things. But there's nothing irrational about them. The things we're going to be strategic about is maybe one way to think about them. But what you correctly point, so that might be glory or some intangible ideal. But what you correctly point out is that one of these, which is vengeance, seems like it's the consequence of actions, that it's almost can be generated by conflict. And that's true. It means that it's the kind of thing, like, I think we are programmed as a species to be vengeant. A lot of our social norms and cultures vary, but they can really augment that as well and make us even more vengeant when wronged. And so if you're engaged in a game, if you're engaged in a strategic interaction with an adversary, you actually don't want to make them vengeful, right? You don't want to do something that's seen as so unjust that they want to attack you, because that's going to make them ignore some of the costs. And then you're going to find it harder to get a bargain. And more importantly, they're going to refuse, because they're willing to pay some price just to punish you. They're going to refuse a whole bunch of bargains that are advantageous to you. So every time you make your enemy vengeful, you're actually you're actually changing that range of deals available to things that are just more and more disadvantageous to you because you just want them to stop. And so we should never do that. We should never start that kind of feud and create those cycles of vengeance. And often we don't, because we can kind of we're like, well, I can try to repress them, but maybe that'll backfire, and then they'll want to turf me out. And so, or maybe I shouldn't invade, because then they'll get really angry and they'll want to punish me no matter what. Right. And so they kind of backwards induct and they decide not to do it. So then you have to explain that first unjust act.
Right.
And subsequent unjust acts. And I think you then do that not through an appeal to things that are misperceptions and irrational, that people make mistakes or that groups make mistakes. And so it's a complex interaction between two of the five logics.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, this is a part of the book that I love and I hadn't really thought about before, is that, well, actually, this is a feature that shows up again and again, and I'd like to return to, which is that you try to make things safer on one margin, and then you make them more dangerous in a different way, or you make things more dangerous in one way, and then there's this offsetting behavioral effect elsewhere that actually makes it safer, and it's ambiguous, like what the net sign is. So, in as much as people want revenge, in as much as they can get into these feuds where they hate the other side and they're willing to pay costs just in order to harm them, you might think, well, that creates a very unstable situation in which wars are often going to escalate and be exceedingly costly and be common. However, if everyone knows that, if they know that, like, even if they do a tiny slight to the other side, that's going to get them to attack back, and then your side will be riled up and they'll attack back, and so it's going to escalate, then you really don't want to even slight the other side at all. And so plausibly, this desire for vengeance could lead to peace because everyone's going to be so cautious about starting it. It's kind of like, nuclear weapons, potentially keeping the peace.
Yeah, sociologists and anthropologists call this peace in the feud.
Right.
Which is that the threat of setting off one of these cycles of violence keeps people from engaging in those acts. But then if you do set it off, it's a real doozy.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the story of any kind of military technology and arming. And as you say, nuclear weapons. Like, nuclear weapons will make war really costly, so it makes it less likely. But if it happens because of some other reason, it's going to be really bad.
Yeah. I think this kind of offsetting behavior phenomenon, I think it shows up elsewhere, where let's say that you elect a president of the United States who's extremely peace-loving and just says, I'm incredibly reluctant to ever use nuclear weapons, or extremely reluctant to go to war.
Yeah.
Then the other side can be like, oh, great. Well, we're going to take advantage of that. And we're going to push up against the boundaries really hard. We're going to invade Taiwan. We're going to do all these other things because they've declared that they're not going to do anything unless we do something even more extreme than that. And so they walk up to the boundary again because they have a particular desired risk, like a level of risk of war. And then that president who's really dovish actually hasn't reduced the net risk of war. They've just changed what fraction of the spoils they received.
Right, which is why we don't fight, but we get stuck in this trap of escalating arms at the very least. But it's also, it is a strategy. I mean, if you want to improve your bargaining position vis-a-vis like an adversarial nation, and you elect a hardliner or someone who's a little bit crazy and unpredictable to become president, that raises the risk of war, but it also improves your bargaining position. And that's a classic sort of, that's very easy to derive from game theory. And then we can think of lots of examples. And, a lot of people criticize, Trump for his, I'm going to keep people guessing. And so it's not clear that's the right strategy. It's certainly a risky strategy. But I mean, it was, in some sense, electing a hawkish, somewhat unpredictable, seemingly crazy and somewhat unconstrained leader is a bargaining strategy vis-a-vis allies and enemies. And we can disagree whether it's the best bargaining strategy, but it is one.
Yeah, I slightly messed up the order here because I feel like this number 2 is slightly blowing into number 3, which is uncertainty, basically. So yeah, the third cause is kind of about this issue that parties don't know exactly how militarily powerful the other side is, and they also don't know how much they're willing to suffer or risk in order to defend their interests. Yeah, can you help explain how that uncertainty makes violence more likely? Right.
So this is a world where we can say, okay, let's assume there's no unchecked leaders. The leader is faithfully representing their group, right? Let's cross that off. Let's assume there's no intangible incentives, right? All we live in is a world where two groups are uncertain about the strength and resolve of the other. So surely we won't have war then, right? And the answer is actually a lot of the time we won't, because they have a real incentive. They might start off thinking, I think I'm pretty strong and they're weak, but erroneously, well, I have incentives to actually invest in information. Like I'm actually going to spend a lot of time with spies and intelligence, and I'm going to spend a lot of time carefully looking at their signals, because I know I don't want to fight, and I know they don't want to fight. And so we're going to try to give each other credible information so we avoid this bad outcome. And so uncertainty isn't like a inevitable path to fighting. But what happens in this situation is you're like, wait a second, are they really as strong as they're telling me? You know, they ran those military parades, they did those border skirmishes, they have these big public investments in arms, whatever, all these things that they're signaling to me. Is that a bluff? Right? It's a little bit like poker, right? And so in that circumstance, because you can't really verify amidst this uncertainty. And so just like in poker, when you're not sure what hand your opponent holds, you might fold, and you might decide sometimes it's worth it to call and see and escalate, then call. And the same is true in warfare. It's sometimes it makes sense to escalate and call amidst this uncertainty. And in fact, it makes sense to be somewhat unpredictable in that, just like you're unpredictable in your bluffing and you're unpredictable in your folding and calling. And so it creates an environment where it's in your strategic interest to sometimes fight.
Yeah. So I was thinking about this and how to model it. I vaguely remember looking at kind of game theory models of poker back when I was an undergrad.
Right.
I think actually, maybe rather than think about poker, because poker has various complications, you can instead imagine a game where two parties are kind of rivals. They each draw a number between 1 and 100. Then they kind of do a poker thing where whichever party has the higher number wins if they both have to end up showing their number, but they don't know one another's number. And they can decide whether to kind of up the ante or call or fold. In that kind of game, sometimes even when you draw a really low number, like 5 or 10, and you're almost certain to lose if the other party calls you, then you still want to bluff, because if you say you always raise when your number is above 50 and you always fold when it's below 50, then you're completely predictable, and the other party can exploit that total predictability. Right. And so you end up, I think you say kind of the best thing is a mixed strategy where you kind of raise in some proportion. There's going to be some function, but you raise proportional to like whether you drew 1 or 100. So you might like always raise if you draw 100 and occasionally do it if you draw 1, and somewhere in between if you draw 50. Is that right? Yeah, I mean, it varies a lot depending how you set up the game. But basically, when you're in this situation where you're really, really weak, and you know you're weak, but there's some uncertainty, you're much less likely to bluff than when say you're potentially more evenly matched. Like that's just, but you're right that the incentives are never zero, or seldom zero, and sometimes they're zero, but there's whole ranges where they're not zero, and that is dangerous territory. Now, after the fact, because the uncertainty always gets resolved, you know, when the fighting begins, as it has, and a lot of the uncertainty has been resolved in the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then we look back at those bets as mistakes. Oh, we were misinformed. And you're like, well, maybe we were guessed wrong. Maybe we had bad information. Maybe we were naive. Maybe we had all sorts of misperceptions. But also, it was very tremendously uncertain, and we didn't really know. So we can't just say that bets where we got lucky were good ones, and bets where we got unlucky were bad ones. That's a bad way to learn from the past. Yeah. You know that this kind of uncertainty bluffing calling model predicts kind of frequent but brief skirmishes, but it has a harder time explaining prolonged wars. Why is that? So it does two things. One is it predicts actually a lot of potential violence, which could be skirmishes, just to capably signal to your enemy how strong you are, right? And so a little skirmish in Kashmir, or a little skirmish on the Chinese-India border, or a little skirmish here, a little skirmish there. In the book, I give the example of gangbanging, which through this now friend and colleague who's a social work and peacemaker in Chicago, but used to be a gang leader. He'd go into the neighboring gang's neighborhood and shoot up buildings. That's violence. That's a way of communicating how strong you are. That's what this colleague of mine was doing. Then, in addition, if you, despite all those signals, you're still not sure about the bluff, you start fighting, typically any of the uncertainty gets resolved pretty quickly, right? So we were really unsure how strong the Russian military was. We were really unsure how plucky and organized the Ukrainian military was. We were really unsure about the unity of Western sanctions. That now we know, right? Cleared up pretty fast. We found out. So now a lot of the uncertainty is resolved. And so we would anticipate that if uncertainty was the main source of fighting, or one of the main sources, that it might wrap up pretty quickly. Sadly, pretty quickly doesn't always mean a week. It might mean 5 months, especially if there's other things leading us to fight. But very seldom do wars go years and years and years. Yeah. Kind of interesting effect of this dynamic in wars and also in negotiations around wars, or indeed any kind of conflict, even just in trade negotiations between countries, is both sides have really strong incentives to give like extremely misleading impressions about their negotiating position, about like what they would accept and what they won't accept. So I noticed this, during the Brexit negotiations between Britain and the EU a couple of years ago. It constantly seemed like they were never going to make a deal, like it was impossible that they would agree on something. And I learned over time to just basically completely ignore this. I thought that this news was worthless. Yeah. It was like worse than the paper it was written on, because of course both sides always want to claim that they're right about to walk away from the table, so they could, because that improves their negotiating position. And basically, as far as I could tell, for someone like me, the situation is inscrutable. There is actually just no way for me to know.
It's true. That is the terrible. Now, that choice to bluff is also a strategic choice, so they don't do it always, but it certainly pays off in a lot of circumstances, and we all do it. If we're going to buy a used car, right? That's exactly the same kind of everyday instinctual bargaining. Oh, I could never pay more than this. Oh, I could never get it off the lot for that much. And so it's the same posturing, because there is some uncertainty. I don't know exactly how much did this dealer pay. I don't know. And he doesn't know how much I'm willing to pay. And the only difference between that situation and conflict is if I don't buy the car, it's not like there's some huge cost that we pay. But like if we started bargaining and then some genie appeared and said, by the way, if you guys don't sell the car, I'm going to execute one of your family members each. And then then we would find a bargain, and we might not find it in our interest to bluff so much, right?
Yeah.
So it's not foregone conclusion that we're going to bluff.
Yeah. This issue showed up also in the lead up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where I was just like completely agnostic about whether they were going to invade, because I was like, well, they have every incentive to claim that they're going to, even if they're not. So literally, I just am not going to know until the tanks roll in, or they don't. And it's like that dynamic where a government has to lie to the other party, and in so doing also lie to their people, it's very difficult for democratic accountability.
Yeah.
Because it's not possible to say one thing to Germany and another thing to voters. So voters actually can't really tell on what basis you're negotiating, and like either keep you or boot you out of office based on your behavior, because you just have to lie to everyone.
And there's layers of uncertainty. So if you're the president of this country, you're not quite sure of the level of support for standing up to an invasion. And you're not quite sure of your population's level of support for you committing an invasion. So there's layers to this game. And so what that might mean is actually, what does negotiation look like as well? Like one quote unquote negotiated outcome would be for Russia to have merely unilaterally sent in tanks and planes, maybe shocking and awing, maybe not, and then people just standing down, right? It's kind of what happened in Crimea, right? Like that's basically exactly. And they said, well, half the Ukrainian military in Crimea defected over to the Russians, half of them quietly retired. Very few shots were shot, and some version of that could have played out. And I don't know that anybody was. A lot of people in retrospect say, "Oh, that was foolish to even think that's true," and I don't think people knew that beforehand.
Yeah. The fourth underlying driver of violence you call commitment problems. Yeah. And it's kind of the inability to commit not to abuse your power in future. Basically, if you have two actors and one is quickly becoming more powerful than the other, then the rising party would probably like to commit to not take too much of the pie, to not exploit the other party in future, because that would stop them from being attacked now.
Yeah.
But no matter what they say, the declining power knows that it's going to be in the rising power's interest to take advantage of them in future. And so, the rising power could basically try to directly pay off the declining power now, not to attack them, which does apparently often happen. But if their rise in power is too steep, then they may just not be able to afford a sufficiently large payout to motivate the declining power not to engage in a preemptive strike in order to stop their rise.
Yeah.
Can you explain how this kind of commitment problem kind of might help explain why World War I occurred?
Sure. And I should say, like, it sounds like an esoteric concept, and you're like, oh, does that really? And I think it's actually so fundamental to understanding so many things. It's actually, political economists also use these commitment problems to understand like a lot of issues of domestic politics and dictatorships and low economic growth. So it's worth thinking a lot about and learning, because I think it ends up being really useful, and all of the world wars. There's some people say that every long war has a commitment problem at its root. I think that's a slight exaggeration, but it's true enough that it's true often enough that it's worth pointing out. And so World War I is one of the classic examples. it's a great example of where a lot of historians are very quick, as I mentioned, to point out to the unchecked leaders in Europe, to the misperceptions that they had about this idea, well, jolly little war home by Christmas, which is actually not what most leaders believed, but people like to tell that story. And they talk about nationalist and other ideologies or intangible incentives that led to war. So we end up explaining World War I with unchecked leaders, misperceptions, and intangible incentives. And then what a good number of other people said, like, well, yes, that's true, but why were we so vulnerable to that? And maybe one of the keywords for this situation you just talked about, and summarized so nicely, which is like this launching a preventative attack and a preventative war. One of the keywords you'll hear in the vernacular is a closing window of opportunity. As soon as you hear closing window of opportunity, it's kind of your signal for a potential commitment problem. And what was going on briefly in World War I was Germany's fear that Russia would soon rise to be so powerful that they would be at a complete strategic disadvantage, and there was an opportunity to prevent that from happening. And that window of opportunity was closing very soon. And it was probably going to close by 1917, 1918, according to some of the German generals who are arguing this. And the historians who don't buy this fully are totally right to say, well, there's ways to get out of that. It wasn't a total commitment problem. And that's why I sort of buy both stories. I'm like, well, it was mostly a commitment problem. It was really hard to find a deal that Russia would be able to commit not to overpower Germany in future and assure Germany of some stability. But it was really hard. And that's the point at which our unchecked leaders and our misperceptions and our intangible incentives keep Europe from making a deal. And so we need both. It's not one or the other.
Yeah. I think some people have argued that commitment problems are also behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I suppose we're constantly courting trouble by talking about a contemporary case. But the argument there goes that basically, so Russia wants influence, power over Ukraine. Whatever their goals within Ukraine are, they want to like have power over what's going on there. And they notice that the Ukrainian military is getting way more competent, way more powerful, as evidently they have over the last 8 years. And apparently also Ukraine was, investing in more equipment, investing in longer range missiles, stuff that would make it easier to defend themselves. These drones that seem to have really packed a punch.
Yeah.
And so the Russians were like, well, okay, Ukraine's not actually going to be more powerful than us in 5 years, but they're going to be more than capable of defending themselves in 5 years. Yeah. So if we're ever going to engage in a kind of preemptive attack in order to prevent them from getting to that stage, then we have to attack now. And that can explain the kind of otherwise quite peculiar and arbitrary seeming timing.
I think to an extent, absolutely. I think you definitely need more than that to explain this invasion because there was a way out. I mean, the way out was for Ukraine to go to the way of Belarus and sort of submit to some degree. And that didn't happen. So I think at minimum, you need an intangible incentive on the Ukraine side, like we said earlier, like the American revolutionaries, this noble refusal to accept the cruel bargain on offer. And those two things combined, and now you have pretty limited space to avoid an invasion, I think. So that's the strategic story.
Yeah. I maybe should have said more at the outset. So I think you and I probably are picturing this diagram in the book, which is kind of this pie chart, where it's like, this is the pie that we have to split between the various different parties. We've got kind of 100 different points of resources. And if violence is going to destroy, say, 20% of the pie, because we're destroying all of the capital, we're destroying all of this output, all of this stuff that we want, then, so you got this like 20% wedge there, which is kind of the negotiating space where both parties would prefer anything inside that wedge.
Yeah.
And each of these different 5 reasons just shrinks that space. It shrinks the size of that wedge because it gives people the reason to go to war in order to learn information about how strong the other side is, gives people intrinsic motivation to go to war. Yeah. It means that if the leaders have different interests, then that slice of the pie is narrower for them than it is for the population as a whole. But it's very rare for one factor to be able to, because violence is so destructive, it's very rare for one factor to be sufficient to shrink that pie to zero.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes there are certainly instances, I think, and it's certainly conceivable, but, these events have a lot of terrible roots and there's always something going on. So I agree, but it's conceivably just one could do it.
Yeah. So balance of power politics is one way that these commitment problem wars can potentially be avoided. Yeah, can you explain how that would work?
So there's one sense in which we think of a balance of power as potentially being stabilizing. So this is a common approach to understanding long pieces for long stretches of European history. So, for the 100 years before World War One. There were of course wars in Europe, but it was a reasonably peaceful time between the Napoleonic Wars, and what this suggested is there was a shifting pattern of alliances that would essentially make sure that no one power could sort of have that incredible rise, create commitment problems, and thus lead to a world war, until, of course, that happened in World War One. But the reason that that's not always particularly stabilizing, I think, is that these shifting alliances and the unpredictability of these alliances can also create the potential for power shifts. And so the example I give in the book actually is this ancient Greek war, the Peloponnesian War, where has actually surprisingly not been analyzed very formally by political scientists through this lens, to my surprise. I was hoping to find the ideas and the explanations served up on a platter, but surprisingly they're not. So my take, because let's be clear, I am not an ancient Greek historian nor a political expert, but nonetheless, my take is that the chief thing that led to this famous long war between Athens and Sparta was the fact that there was a previously neutral party that was sitting by the side, another Greek state, that all of a sudden started to look like it might tip towards one side rather than the other. And so it created this sudden potential shift in power that would forever change the balance of power, and led one party to sort of preventatively strike, in this case, Sparta, as this neutral party crept towards Athens. And so it goes to a larger lesson of game theory, which is that everything I've told you so far, this natural gravitational pull of peace, makes a lot of sense when we're talking about two players trying to find some alternative, and we use that pie that you talked about. Not so true, not necessarily true when you have many players and you have these shifting patterns of alliances and all sorts of possible factions. And so that in that multiplayer setting, some of the predictability breaks down, and it's a little bit harder to maintain peace. And we do live in a multipolar world. And so that it isn't quite so simple as peace all the time, peace, and very rarely war. There's more room for this to happen with all these actors.
Yeah. Yeah, in that ancient Greek example, I guess the stylized description is that Athens was this rising power. Sparta was kind of declining relative to Athens. And so they were getting very skittish. They were getting very nervous about what Athens might do in future when they're more powerful. Interesting thing is, because there was this third party, this kind of third balancing power, Athens could be in favor of that third party allying with Sparta, so that Sparta is less concerned about the rise of Athens because they'll still be balanced in the future, and so won't feel the need to launch a preemptive attack on Athens. It's like this third party makes a commitment kind of credible, or is a way of trading off something now, so that Sparta doesn't have to worry.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't want. I mean, the neutral power had the second largest navy after Athens, so they didn't necessarily want that. Would not be their preferred solution. Their preferred solution was actually for this third power, Corcyra, to remain neutral. And they tried to maintain that. So as Corcyra tried to pull them into some of their disputes and things, the Athenians resisted. And they tried to be neutral observers, and it was just a very difficult path to walk.
The fifth cause of violence you call misperceptions. And I guess I might have got, or I think this audience might think of it as systematic poor judgment, or poor judgment that occurs in a systematic way. Basically, kind of these are the thinking traps that people classically fall into in conflict situations. Failing to put yourself in the mindset of someone else, not thinking up all of the possible underlying reasons that might explain an adversary's actions, kind of jumping to the worst conclusion rather than thinking about how their actions could be more innocently explained. I guess also, overestimating our capabilities relative to other parties. Maybe the main thing that jumped out at me about this chapter is that you cite a lot of psychology research that I personally would be pretty wary of relying on because it's old enough. I suppose maybe this could apply to all psychology research even up to now, but at least the older stuff, I really worry that there wasn't widespread enough bad research practices within the social sciences that you really can't trust that the results are legitimate. Yeah, how did you try to handle that issue?
So, I think a couple things happen. One is there's just, first of all, we have an endless list of behavioral biases that people have proposed, in which there's both good and bad research for. So mostly I was searching for the ones that could actually affect strategic behavior. So I think I approached it theoretically, in the sense of I think we have a really good theoretical sense of what kinds of biases are going to be worse for this particular situation. A lot of the behavioral science and psychology and economics that people are so familiar with right now are actually about things that have to do with maximizing behavior, about optimizing a choice, not in a strategic interaction with somebody else, but just either with my future self or just or just a mistake I make now in the moment, ignoring the actions of anybody else. And a lot of those just aren't that important, or just recede in importance in this particular kind of strategic interaction when the stakes are so high. Because a lot of behavioral biases that we talk about go away when the stakes are super high. Not all of them, but many do. We have to focus on the limited number of ones that persist in big groups and bureaucracies that are working really hard to avoid a really, really bad outcome, and then can keep working 3 years into the whole mess. Like that's what we need. So it limits the scope of possible things is maybe the first step. Then you have to dive into the evidence on which ones actually seem to be true. And I was guided a lot by the history and case studies in the sense of what came up when I was reading about Israel-Palestine and the Northern Irish and the Greeks and this and that were a set of persistent biases. So in some sense, it narrowed down where to look. And then you have to go to the harder psychological evidence, which, as you note, can be spotty, whether it's in psychology or in economics or whatever. I try to be clear about when things are stronger than not. I think the preponderance of evidence in places, plus the tie-ins to the cases, plus the theory, they buttress one another. But, no one is really, that's not no one. There have been lots of efforts. I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Rose McDermott and Bob Jervis who have been trying to categorize and really systematize our understanding of these misperceptions in international relations. And so we're getting closer, but there's really a dearth of attention in research to these specific problems. So I just think I just tried to be transparent about the strongest case. The strongest case is the conceptual one, and the evidence is suggestively saying this is true.
Yeah, I think despite that question, I think it's very likely that all of these misperceptions play a role. I mean, one reason is if a psychology experiment, firstly, if there's one study, that's a really bad sign. If there's a whole bunch of studies, that's a whole lot better. But even then, a whole literature can be confused.
Yeah.
But a big thing is all of these make a ton of sense to me. None of these are counterintuitive. All of these are things we could see in our own minds, I think.
Yeah.
And that just that prior probability, that the fact that it makes so much sense, feels right, isn't surprising, I think, makes it a lot more believable.
Yeah.
Yeah, one interesting one, an example that you gave for how we fail to put ourselves in the mindset of others is that we could even fail to put ourselves in the mindset of ourselves at other times. There's an example where people who are hungry, I think, buy more food at the supermarket.
Exactly.
People who are cold buy warmer clothes rather than anticipating how cold they're going to be in future. I was thinking about, this isn't that important, but I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, actually, I think this could be rational because it's so easy to tell what your preferences are now. You can just, inspect them. It immediately feeds back without any energy.
Yep.
Actually analyzing it and trying to figure out how you would felt in the past or how you will feel in the future is more effort demanding.
Yeah.
And so if a decision's not very important, like how much food to buy at the supermarket, then maybe it actually just isn't worth the effort. That wouldn't really explain the war case, but...
Well, it could probably doesn't but might for a very specific reason. I mean, you're saying there's a transaction cost to thinking through something.
Exactly.
And a lot of behavioral biases are about transaction costs and our brains working efficiently to avoid them, especially for lots of everyday decisions, which makes total sense. And the reason I don't, in some sense, I could have a 6 bucket of explanations called transaction costs, that it's actually expensive and difficult to negotiate and to think about your opponent's war interests and things. And those transaction costs are a cause of war. And technically that's true. But as a matter of fact, because war is so costly, the transaction costs mostly pale. So it's more of a conceptually true thing that I just think isn't worth elevating to the level of a 6 cause. But conceptually, it is a 6 cause, and it's the source of a lot of the behavioral biases that I think don't matter in the case of war.
Yeah, if a country ended up in a war with another country and you asked them why, and they said, we couldn't afford the diplomat's salary.
Right.
it would strain credulity.
Yeah, I mean, there's to some there are limits on our spy budgets and our diplomatic budgets, and you might say we invest too little in some of these things. But yeah, I think we put a lot of effort into discerning what's going on. Yeah.
I think of the misperceptions that you listed, the one that I'm most nervous about is kind of overestimating your capabilities relative to others.
Yeah.
Because from what I've read, so I think, people have this strong perception that people just always overestimate themselves. They think they're better drivers than everyone else. They think they're better at maths than everyone else. They think they're more beautiful than everyone else. But I think if you look more closely, you see that there's quite a lot of situations in which people kind of underplace their ability relative to others.
Yeah.
I think some of those, from what I've read, is kind of where a task is difficult, like just difficult in absolute terms, where they've never done it before, where measurement of success is objective rather than subjective, and where it's not central to their identity. A case that we talked about with the previous guest, Spencer Greenberg, is marathons, where people actually underplace themselves because for most people, including me, being able to run a marathon isn't key to our identity. I've never done it before. It's pretty clear whether I did it or didn't. And it's also something that I just think of as difficult. Arguably, fighting in a war has some of these characteristics, and you could imagine a leader underestimating their ability to fight on the field because they don't have experience. It's clear whether you lose.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So I think this is just something we don't know the answer to. It's just hugely important. So like speculatively, like I think that there's might be a lot of interpersonal variation. So I don't think all CEOs are overconfident. I don't think all mutual fund managers are overconfident, but there might be selection into CEOs and selection in mutual fund managers that draws overconfident types. And then if you happen to get one, they might get you into trouble, right? And they clearly exist. So, but it's not every CEO. So something's going on. And it's not in your interests to hire as a firm or to hire consistently overconfident people. So why it exists is a bit of a puzzle. And then I think we have to understand why it persists even in like a somewhat checked and balanced organization, like a shareholder held publicly traded corporation. And it does. And so it's there's a bureaucratic answer rather than maybe like a purely psychological answer. And I struggled to find much on that. I looked exhaustively. I'm sure there's things I missed, but I don't think we really have a good answer to why our mutual fund managers are just so ridiculously overconfident in their performance.
Yeah. I think it could be the case that, on average, as in these studies of kind of overplacement and underplacement, it could be that, a typical person isn't overconfident in general. There's just some things where they're overconfident and some things where they're underconfident. But it wouldn't shock me if politicians by nature tend to be overconfident, because just to begin with, most people who run for office, most people who try to pursue a career in politics fail. So maybe it selects the people who are willing to go for long shots or people who are willing to accept.
I think we know there's selection, but then there's counter incentives against those selection.
Oh, yeah.
Now in politics, it might be hard to discern and get those people out of power. But if you run if you run a trading firm, you should be aware of the selection problem, that I don't just want a bunch of overconfident young yahoos because that's going to lose money. And over time, the bigger and better firms should emerge that don't have that problem. So there's some inefficient persistence of overconfidence in something as high stakes as our financial markets and our largest corporations. So if it persists there, where there's like information and explicit measurement and accountability and instantaneous results, it has to persist in political situations.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be nice if we understood more about that?
Yeah. So some of these misperceptions you might expect would be very prominent for individuals, but they would be tempered in groups, because you think, okay, so an individual might fail to put themselves in another country's shoes.
Yeah.
But, surely we have a diplomatic corps. This is kind of their whole job, is to think about it from the other side's perspective. And they would help to correct this mistake. But I think interpersonal interactions can in some cases make this even worse, or at least it doesn't fix it as much as you might think, because kind of interactions between people within a society can increase the pressure to indulge in misperceptions, because you don't want to say, okay, a classic one that really stands out to me is, imagine that Joe Biden got up and gave a speech where he was like, well, you might be very mad with Putin, but you got to understand, the fourth cause of war is commitment problems, and Ukraine was improving its military, and so there was a closing window of opportunity in which Putin could act. Boo. Exactly. People are going to hate this kind of explanation of his behavior, and so that's crazy example. But you could get this within a bureaucracy, even where kind of people don't really want to go to the meeting and be like, I'm the person who deeply understands Putin's mind and can get myself inside that, because you look like a jerk.
100%. But the tricky, a great analysis of the late Bob Jervis and his analysis of intelligence failures in the U.S. and in the invasion of Iraq is like a great study in some particular bureaucratic failures to process information and draw the right conclusion and insulation. The thing is most of the time, I don't think that happens so seriously that this terrible action, which is war, happens. And so it only happens some of the time, or maybe it happens all the time, but not to a degree that it's decisive. But then sometimes our decision making gets better through bureaucratic decision. Everyone thinks bureaucratic sounds like a bad word, but bureaucratic means like systematized, rule based. So and a lot of our decisions are better when we make them in groups. And so there's a lot of difference of opinion. I get some criticisms from colleagues saying this is nonsense. This group decision making, a lot of this goes away. And then other people saying this is nonsense. The fact that you're even acknowledging that group decision making could ever get better than individual decision making ignores all this other. And the fact is like this is one of those additional instances. I've pointed at one or two in the previously where I think we don't know a lot. It has a lot in common with us not knowing about why mutual fund managers are overconfident. We've had all this investment, all this behavioral science that is so intuitive now to so many people is super individualistic. And almost none of us probably can quote, we can all quote 100 studies, right? Even the average pull person off the street, probably they can tell you about one, but nobody can tell you about something that sort of about how this breaks down organizations and some intuition about it. And I thought, it must be out there. And some of it is, but that's our big failing as a social science right now.
Yeah. Okay, we've come to the end of kind of laying out these 5 different drivers of violence in order. Just to recap for people, they were unchecked interests, intangible incentives, uncertainty, commitment problems, and then misperceptions. What's the best argument for a cause of violence that doesn't fit into the above 5 buckets? I guess that was my question. You've maybe already answered that with the transaction cost thing, but is there another a 7th potential bucket?
Well, I think I also mentioned this multiplayer problem. And I talked about it as maybe a kind of commitment problem because it creates these shifting and hard to predict alliances. It can also create, if you think about a big problem, if you're trying to bargain with an enemy, is the fragmentation of your group and splinter factions going off and doing something. Like George Washington was a splinter faction. The British had to worry about. Yasser Arafat spent a lot of his time worrying about splinter factions, things of this nature. So is that a separate bucket or not? I think this is somewhere I don't think we have the equipment to understand for sure. And that's kind of, in both of these cases, I think we push against the frontier of what we know.
Yeah.
So it could just be that it fits into the buckets, or it could be its own bucket. And I haven't decided yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's the thing that you've said so far that would be most controversial among political scientists or economists?
Well, the way I've tried to skirt controversy is not by trying to say this is the way the Iraq War started and not this way. I just am trying to classify people's explanations. So it's a way of actually trying to keep everybody happy, which is maybe that's my inner Canadianness. I'm trying to think so partly I just assiduously skirt all that, and then maybe I haven't heard it yet, but because the book hasn't come out. So you should probably ask me a couple of weeks. It comes out April 19th, the 21st in the UK. 2 weeks after that, I will know the answer to the question.
Yeah, I expect you'll get some people who are maybe mad about the case studies because your description might seem like it's justifying really bad behavior. Yeah,
the dispassionateness bothers a lot of people, not the political scientists. The political scientists are empathetic to that sort of strategic empathy that we're trying to understand these people. At the same time, I avoided the contemporary conflicts in the book for a couple. One is I just didn't want it to be dated the day it came out because things change. I wanted to sort of this to be more timeless, but more importantly, I didn't want people to get angry about the cases so much because I wanted to sort of provide that dispassionate toolkit, and still talking about for people in the UK, Northern Ireland is still very fresh. For people in the US and the UK, the wars in Iraq is still very fresh. So I'm not totally skirting things, but people are finding it very hard to think and think analytically about the Russian invasion of Ukraine right now. And that's actually a problem for peace.
Yeah. So one dynamic that I wasn't sure where it fit into these 5 categories is that people argue that if it's easier to win a war if you start it first, and that's true of both parties, then that's a reason to attack someone else before they attack you. And it's a reason for them to attack you really quickly, so you want to get in even sooner. So you get this kind of race to attack. Yeah, where does that fit?
That's another classic kind of commitment problem, because both of you would like to avoid this costly outcome, which is war. And because you have to make this simultaneous, instantaneous choice, and there's no third party to restrain you, you can make it. There's lots of varieties of the commitment problem, actually. I just happen to emphasize the one that I think is most intuitive to people, which is the preventative war, and not it was a pretty comprehensive book already without being super comprehensive. But so I think you've picked up on something that I slunk past in the service of not trying
brevity.
People's patience.
Yeah.
So very quickly, you've brought us to the 201 class again.
Yeah, that's what subscribers to this show want.
Perfect.
Another one, maybe the answer is just going to be the same, but another kind of game theory model that I've heard about, that people talk about, especially in the context of nuclear war, is this kind of beautiful little setup, I think created by Thomas Schelling, who wrote this famous game theory book, The Theory of Conflict. Yeah, the setup is you're standing at the edge of a cliff, chained by the ankle to someone else. You'll be released, and one of you will get a large prize as soon as the other gives in. How do you persuade the other guy to give in when the only method at your disposal, threatening to push the other party off the cliff, would doom both of you because you're tied together? The answer is you start dancing closer and closer to the edge of the cliff. That way, you don't have to convince them that you would do something totally irrational, like plunge both of you off the edge of the cliff. You just have to convince them that you are prepared to take a higher risk than they are of accidentally falling off the cliff. If you can convince them that you're more risk-taking than them, then you can win. Where does that fit?
So it kind of depends how you set it up. I think the way it's set up there is it's mostly a story about uncertainty. Like fundamentally, the problem is I don't know whether you're crazy or how resolved you are. So it goes back to that whole discussion we had about it's a bluff, but it might not be a bluff.
Yeah.
And so you're creeping closer to the edge as a way of signaling but here you're trying to signaling your willingness to just burn the whole place down if you don't get what you want. And the reason why creeping close to the edge is a signal is because only, it's a good signal only if like nobody but the craziest person as you slowly get there would actually do that. So now you're credibly signaling. Now the fact is actually standing like far from the edge or close to the edge, I don't think it's a perfect, example, because that's actually not a very credible signal at all, because I'm not actually going over the edge. It's not that dangerous. So that's one way to think about it, is it's just uncertainty and bluffing, and it can result in somebody potentially going off the cliff, and it can be strategic. And I think what subsequent game theorists did was refine that logic. Like Schelling sort of created all of these puzzles for people to work out, which then a lot of people just filled in the blanks. The other way it could work, though, is again related to something we mentioned, I think, earlier, which is to say that, like, let's say we get to elect, each group gets to elect who gets chained. You may have an incentive to elect the crazy person to be chained up, right? So that because you want to, because that'll actually improve your bargaining position, but it's a difficult calculated decision. And so you might play a mixed strategy in whether or not you elect a crazy person.
Yeah. All of these strategic cases, they suggest that there is kind of some minimal risk of war that we can get to that we can't get below, because it's just not a stable competitive situation, because one party then has a reason to increase the risk of war.
So, I mean, that's like the central contribution of game theory to the study. It's to say, well, actually, the fact that we have shifting power, the fact that we live in an uncertain world, and the fact that there are unchecked leaders, which game theorists would call agency problems, means that there can be lots of rational war. And that's a huge contribution. I think what the problem is, for a long time, that discipline has totally ignored the irrational war. And not tried to do this sort of mind meld that I've tried to do in the book, and try to make some of these things work in our models and explore the implications. So we don't have the same, the thing is, you never really know, and I'm not a game theorist, but I do know enough that you never really know how the model and the prediction is going to work out until you work it out. And there's a lot of counterintuitive insights that might seem obvious if I explain it now, but weren't obvious beforehand. And that's what I think is, there's a lot of things I think we think about irrational behavior and the story you've just told, that if you actually work it out, you might not get the conclusion you expect. And maybe the sad thing is there's maybe only a handful of people who actually work on conflict-related game theory these days.
It's just out of fashion?
It's just, I don't know. It's also like it's not that big a field, and it's also not like it's a hard to acquire skill. Maybe it's out of fashion. It hasn't been favored by the technology of research, right? Like, there's so many empirical researchers, and a lot of the empirical research has boomed because Well, let's think it. When I went to college, we didn't have computers. There was no software to run statistical analysis. And if there was, our computer wasn't fast enough to do it, and nobody created the data. And so we've had an empirical revolution that's sort of because of the sort of shifting technology of research. And so it's not so much made it unfashionable. It's just people chasing the frontier are not doing as much theory.
Yeah. I guess now you can run too many regressions. We've got the opposite problem.
Exactly.
I guess we had to pause in 1992 or something.
Right.
The model that you present in the book is kind of this dividing pie thing. And for simplicity in the book, you kind of conceptualize things in terms of, different groups have different levels of power, and that changes their probability of winning the war and getting the whole pie, or at least the whole pie that's remaining after the destruction of the war, which is a nice simplification. But it seems like, more often in conflict, a small group would almost certainly lose a war because they're just like so much weaker. And instead what's going on is that they have some ability to harm a much more powerful party, even if they can't like actually win a pitched battle. Does thinking about dividing up the pie more in proportion to how much you can harm someone else rather than your chance of winning an outright war kind of change anything important about the conclusions that spit out?
Generally, no. I think that's why I could make the simplification is most of the things we get are intact. I think what you end up getting is I think you then start to understand things like terrorism better. Terrorism is the weapon of the weakest. It's the way that you exercise bargaining power versus an incredibly strong foe. Not because you think the terrorists are going to manage to take over the country, which very seldom happens, but they leverage violence against civilians, but the fear of violence to obtain concessions, or obtain some other aim. And so I think it helps you understand a greater variety of violence, but a lot of the same principles, the idea that peace is optimal and that and a lot of the 5 sources of breakdown still apply. So
I want to talk a little bit about this issue that I'm kind of confused about. I've been reading this book, Only the Dead, by Bear Braumoller, where he does a whole bunch of statistical analysis to try to figure out whether wars are becoming less common, like the initiation of wars is becoming less common, or their escalation is becoming less frequent. He has this really interesting quote that stood out at me when I was reading it this week, which is, second, the fact that both intensity and severity are not just thick-tailed, but also fit a power law distribution well, is especially ominous. That fact means that the outcomes of wars are consistent with a process in which the only difference between a small war and a very large one is random chance. Even people who can manage to wrap their heads around the incredible escalatory potential of war often find this point hard to believe. Don't human beings have control over the outcomes of wars? Can't we just put a stop to them if they're getting too bloody? There's a short answer to this objection and a longer, more detailed one. The short answer is that yes, we certainly can put a stop to a war that we're fighting if we're willing to lose. But if we were willing to lose, we probably wouldn't be fighting the war in the first place, would we? So something I still don't quite know how to model in my head is the choice that both parties have in some sort of auction kind of scenario where they're both fighting one another over something that they care about, and they have a choice in each period to either like fold or raise. Like they can fight harder or not, and kind of they both end up paying the price of the war. So it's sort of a double pay thing, whereas like they both either have to pay with effort or with the violence that's inflicted on them. How can one think about that more structurally, the choice to escalate or not?
Let's see. So, I mean, I like that book a lot. I read a long time ago. I would say the first caution I would just say is that there is a difference between statistical noise and real randomness, which is to say that like the things that aren't in our model that we can't observe might be what's driving the ones that escalate from the ones that don't. And we actually don't have that many wars to study.
Yeah.
And so our statistical power to like discern what's noise or not really deteriorates. And we actually we can't even measure like most of the things I just talked about. Like, is there a commitment problem? Is there an intangible incentive? Is there some ideological issue at stake? And is hard to observe. How do you measure that in the data? And so those don't go into the models. And so we end up we see a lot of escalation. We see a lot of non-escalation. And then there's a whole bunch of conflicts we never observed. They're not in the data set because they weren't conflicts. So it's just hard to do. And so then I think we have to think a little bit more, and we can run regressions and do careful studies about what escalates. Once again, I think the most important things we can't measure. So that's why, in spite of being this sort of, in my day job, this sort of applied statistician in some ways, when it comes to understanding why we fight or why we escalate, I end up going back to the cases and the theory as a lot for the guidance. And then thinking about how we'd build better evidence on that kind of thing. So So, for example, like, what does it mean to refuse to lose? And I think one interpretation of that is there's circumstances. So one is to say losing entirely just isn't in our bargaining space. That we actually just want to find something. Getting zero isn't an option because we can always do better by fighting than zero. So there's a rational story there. And then we have to say, well, why didn't we get something in our bargaining range? But there's another interpretation that would say sometimes there's something in that bargain that we should accept and we refuse to, like Ukrainians or American revolutionaries compromising on their liberty. And that's hard to predict, right? Why did Ukrainians resist and the Belarusians did not? Why have there been color revolutions in some Eastern European countries and there have not been there hasn't been a major color revolution in Russia? Why didn't the 2018 protests escalate? Why did repression against protesters in one place work and media control in one place work, and why did it unravel in the other? So that's just hard to answer. We have some answers, I think, but I mean, that to me is like what's going on so there's a certain sort of unpredictability to it that is not because it's just a power law or something mechanistic, but because we don't observe. It's just hard to predict.
Yeah. So a kind of model that I had in mind is an extension of the sort of uncertainty poker thing that we were talking about. So as we noted, like a slightly perverse implication of the uncertainty, needing to bluff, needing to seem tough, needing to signal that you have resolve thing, is that a weaker party can choose to escalate a war or start a war or accept that a war is going to happen, even when they suspect that they're weaker and that they're going to like lose in a direct sense, because they have to seem fierce. They have to, they want to seem like they're not bluffing, like they're willing to go to war if it comes to it.
Right.
And the optimal strategy involves randomization here. So the party might say, well, we've drawn a random number, we've decided to escalate in this case in order to signal our fierceness. And the other party could basically do the same thing. And you could just get extremely unlucky where all sides decide to escalate again and again and like proceed to a really full-scale war that they never really wanted in the first place, just because they feel like it's necessary in order to like signal the kind of tough guys that they are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does make sense. I think it's hard to get to a long war from that. I think that escalation, and both being willing to do that is improbable enough that, but except in a world where it goes back to this multiplayer games where
everyone's watching.
And so, if I'm Saddam Hussein facing the U.S., as I point out in the book, like I was really struck by, and now I don't remember which historian pointed this out, was that in Saddam's mind, the U.S. wasn't even enemy number one or enemy number two, wasn't even enemy number three. Saddam Hussein was chiefly worried about Iran. He was worried about the Shiites. He was worried about Israel. And they were all watching what Saddam would do. And likewise, when the United States was trying to convince the Taliban government of Afghanistan that we'll invade if you don't hand over bin Laden, both the Taliban were thinking about their reputation, but more importantly, I think the United States was thinking about every other potential enemy, conventional or terrorist, that would be watching to see what they do. And so I don't think we can understand America's 20-year war, and I don't think we can understand Saddam Hussein's brinksmanship or the Bush decision to invade Iraq without thinking about how they were trying to, in an uncertain world, signal resolve to a wider audience in order to move every other bargaining game a little bit in their favor.
Yeah, that's the thing that can make a lot of sense, I suppose, of how you'd be willing to bear such huge costs. Because, like, why would you go into a total war just to show that you're fierce? Like, you're losing everything that you were trying to protect. So you need to have some, like, broader considerations that are beyond the scope of that war in order to make sense of the costs. I think maybe let's come back to that. Because I want to talk a bit about the war in Ukraine and like what we've gotten right and wrong, and maybe like how these models get applied to that beyond what we've already talked about. And I think this might be a good case to bring up later. So basically, I've got to be following what both of us have been saying about the war in Ukraine, and kind of over time, I've started to worry that at least I've gotten some stuff wrong, or at least my recommendations in some areas would have been harmful if they'd been followed. And I think kind of you have a similar way of analyzing these issues, so maybe you've done the same. I guess, so we predicted, well, I guess you thought that Russia probably wouldn't invade Ukraine. I guess, basically, you just thought that on priors it probably wouldn't invade because it was a bad idea.
Yeah.
Is there anything more like systematic that we can learn from that? Or is it potentially the case that you just got unlucky?
To be determined. I mean, we don't we don't really know what's going on. Like, and we'll, a good example is I have a Russian colleague who's eminent game theorist and was once the head of one of those eminent universities in Moscow. He's now here, who has a completely different view than mine. He obviously has more information, right? But he's, despite being a strategic thinker and someone who studies strategic thinkers, he thinks this is very irrational. And it's all misperceptions and intangible incentives in an insular, degenerated inner circle around Putin. I don't know if that's right. I'm not totally persuaded by him. I certainly think it's a role. I think I can't quite convince myself he's fully right. Not everyone agrees with him, even who are other experts. But it's a good example. It's a totally plausible state of the world. So what we learn from this is going to depend on what was actually going on. Because I can articulate, and I have here, like the strategic logic of the invasion. Especially Russia's strategic logic to invade makes even more sense in like a cold, calculated, brutal way, but in a real politic, kind of sense, it makes sense. Given if the Ukrainians are these nobly intransigent defenders of liberty, then the compromise, then you're just going to have to seize it. Is the rationale, just like that was maybe the quote unquote correct decision for the UK in the American Revolution. So, but if I'm wrong and my colleague is right, that they're just not thinking strategically at all, that means that any solution that follows my advice would be a terrible one. Likewise, if he's wrong, any solution that follows his advice would be a terrible one. It's a little bit like going back to our doctor analogy. Yeah. Like you have to have the treatment suits the disease, and we don't have a clear diagnosis right now because there's so many mysteries.
Yeah. So I suppose, you might disagree about which of the 5 drivers is doing most of the work. And there's kind of a question of like how personal is it versus how strategic is it?
One thing I would say is never believe anyone who's super confident. Yeah. Because that to me is what's misleading. That's to me what's misleading with so many people is an unwillingness to admit uncertainty over which of the 5 is operative when they're all plausible is suspicious.
Yeah. So I suppose part of the reason to think that war was unlikely was that it would be bad for Russia. And it seems like probably ex post it is going to turn out to be bad for Russia. And yet they did it anyway. Something that I've read, I guess I need to maybe look into this, but people who've kind of looked into the cases of countries that initiated wars of choice, like over the last 100 years, like how often does it work out positively for them in like people's general assessment? And it seems like it's very rare that it works out in the interest of the country as a whole. Like things usually go worse than they expect. The costs tend to be higher. If that's the case, then like maybe this is slightly the wrong framework because we're just going to get wars happening surprisingly often when it's not in the interest even of the party that's choosing to do it.
I think the right way to ask that question would actually be to say, how many times did it make sense to credibly threaten violence? And then potentially be, roll the dice and decide to use it, right? So the credible use of violence is extremely important, not just in achieving your interest, but in maintaining peace as well. So I think that would be the fair comparison. Like if we think that violence is by definition the inefficient thing to do, then we're kind of stacking the deck. Of course, it was always the wrong thing to do. It typically is not going to work out in your interest because we know the negotiated solution. But so we have to have the fair comparison. For example, like the one example I like to point out, everybody knows about the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Most people don't know about the U.S. invasion of Haiti. And that's because they won before they even landed the planes. All it was the credible threat of actually the invasion and actually having the planes in the air with the troops. And a coup leader, non-democratic coup leader said, okay. And more often than not, it doesn't even come to like putting the troops on the planes and having them over the Gulf of Mexico, right? So those instruments of power are in many countries. And so that's why the U.S. arms. That's why the U.S. and any imperial power or any power gets its way in the world, because it can credibly threaten violence.
Yeah, I suppose going to war in a case where it's not in your interests might be an even stronger signal because it shows you're crazy enough to do it, even if it's like too costly to you in a specific case.
That is one explanation for the 20 years that the U.S. spent in Afghanistan.
Right.
That it's a costly signal exercise. And from one perspective, it's not clear. It was costly to the Afghans. It's not clear how costly it was to the United States. It was, you could say, it cost about 0.5% of GDP, and in bad years, dozens of deaths, and other years, many fewer. And that was the price paid for no terror attacks on U.S. soil and intimidating potential future al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
Ex ante, is that a choice that any president would willingly pay? Or a price that they would willingly pay? Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So kind of the obvious thing that I think both of us got wrong, along with a lot of other people, I guess, to be fair, is that at least my thought was Ukraine should probably be willing to give up more than it seemed like it was willing to give up in order to prevent the war from happening. Because I assumed, as I think many people did, that their military position was very weak, that Russia would... So my prediction was that Russia would have a hell of a time trying to occupy Ukraine.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, they'd be at least able to sweep in to begin with and try to oust the government. But basically, it seems like the things that people predicted would happen with the occupation, where they'd struggle to do it, kicked in on day 2. They're just attacked on all sides. And it's kind of this like failed occupation, even just of the border areas. Now, one way of making sense of this is just that it was extremely uncertain. Like, this is just a case of uncertainty on this list. We, along with Russia, along with lots of other parties, thought, well, Ukraine was weaker than it was, but maybe the Ukrainians got lucky, or maybe Zelensky had kind of private information that he couldn't credibly communicate about just how resolved they were and like how strong their military was. But in a sense, we just got unlucky. What's the probability that we got like something else more structurally wrong than that we misunderstood the situation?
Yeah, I mean, what I've heard, not so reliably, but what I've heard from some people who are studying this more intently than I am is that, for example, U.S. intelligence, what you just sort of said, your expectation about how strong Russia was relative to Ukraine was not inconsistent with U.S. intelligence reports. And so maybe those were systematically wrong and structurally wrong. And maybe we'll find out. I mean, I'm not sure that'll ever get resolved. No one's ever going to open up the Ukrainian Russian archives to the extent that, say, the CIA let scholars like Bob Jervis peer in. So I think probably it's mostly uncertainty. Like, what's structurally wrong? I think, say, Americans have not invested a great deal in understanding the Ukraine. I don't know that, I'm guessing we don't have huge diplomatic missions there, didn't before the war, and we're certainly training their military, but I'm not sure how much of the foreign policy apparatus was that experienced. So maybe it was more uncertain than it could have been if people were taking this threat more seriously. It's also possible, I think the idea that in order to preserve power and by becoming a more personalized and repressive leader, systematically over the last 10 years, Putin has manufactured an inner circle that is insular, that is full of second-rate people, a defense minister with zero military experience, that he has, in order to preserve his power, built a rickety structure that fed him bad information. That's a really plausible story.
Yeah.
It's 100% true to some extent. Whether or not that's it, and it was no uncertainty, I think it's a combination.
Yeah. So, following the conversation about this, I guess there's a bunch of folks who are somewhat jubilant now and would say, people who wanted to engage in appeasement of Russia, people who wanted to reach some kind of negotiated settlement ahead of time, kind of like me, we had it wrong. And we shouldn't have done that because Russia was asking far too much relative to their military strength. And I think there's like a lot to be said for that. On the other hand, I worry that people could now, because we've been kind of like happily surprised by how the war has gone from a military sense, we're like not paying attention to the fact that a bunch of cities have basically just been flattened, that tens of thousands of civilians are dead, that the economy of Ukraine is doing much worse than it would have otherwise. Yeah. And that even now, like even knowing that the military has overperformed, the war has been so costly, and not just for Ukraine, but for the world, for like the global system, that even a bad agreement, even after all of this, even after you've done unusually well, could still have been better than the outcome that is now going to be on the table.
Yeah, and quite honestly, let's think about how this might resolve. It's easy to imagine a world where in 6 months, Russia de facto controls and has incorporated much of eastern Ukraine and Crimea into itself. Maybe Ukraine doesn't acknowledge that officially. Maybe the West doesn't acknowledge that in law. It seems implausible. They might, but let's say they don't. But they kind of recognize that that's what it is. And Ukraine, in order to attain a peace agreement, declares neutrality, does not militarize, does not acquire these long-range missiles, for example. Everyone renounces Ukraine's eligibility for NATO, et cetera, et cetera. Let's say all of the things happen. You're like, well, that kind of was one of the deals on offer beforehand. Now, you can say, well, Putin, that was like one of the less attractive options for Putin. And given that he thought he would do better, he might not have accepted that. Maybe. But yeah, I'm not sure the way things shake out, because Ukraine is relatively weak, no matter how well they've been doing. I'm not sure that the final outcome is going to look that different from what was on the table in the beginning.
Yeah. So let's come back to the reputation and escalation thing. So I think this is going to be, some listeners will be shouting into their podcasting app about this. Basically, a key reason why it would have been bad for the Ukraine to make such a deal where it gave up part of its territory to Russia in order to see off a war is that this is the way in which a powerful country like Russia can just bully countries one by one and take advantage of everyone around them. You can imagine so now they don't have to fight a war in Ukraine. They've stolen a bunch of its territory. Now kind of the lines are renegotiated. But now they can just go and do that again to someone else, right?
Yeah.
They can go and bully them. And so the argument goes that kind of Ukraine, and indeed like all of the countries that face a threat from Russia, including the West as a whole, need to draw a line in the sand. And even though like what Russia might be asking for wouldn't be worth a total war, we have to be willing to go to war to an extreme, to suffer enormous costs in order to prevent ourselves from being picked off one by one. And ultimately, in the long run, paying a huge price.
So first of all, I think Russia's divide and conquer strategy with its neighbors has been working, and they've not had any mechanism by which they can band together to collectively resist this. That's also, Tim Fry is a Russia expert at Columbia University, has a fabulous book published last year where he also talks about that's how many dictators, including Putin, grab power and personalize power, is there's lots of oligarchs, there's lots of military generals, there's lots of powerful governors, but they were never banded together to collectively resist him. And so he was able to sort of divide and conquer. And so that's a strategy that works well for him. And now there is an alliance, the NATO alliance, plus Ukraine, that is drawing a line. Sort of, right? The NATO isn't really drawing that firm line. They're supporting Ukraine. They're not actually allies. They're not militarily getting involved. So you can understand maybe the West's willingness to fuel this war on those terms. And that's a kind of unchecked leaders or unchecked interests argument, right? That says, listen, Ukrainians are paying the costs, not us. It's really easy to draw a line in the sand if it's not our sand. It's the story behind every proxy war. So we're fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. It's a nobler proxy war than most proxy wars, but every proxy war is in some ways the product of unchecked interests. Because there's some superpower or some neighboring power that's fueling one side of the conflict, even when it makes sense to deal from the perspective of those two very local warring parties.
Yeah. So one narrative is we have to arm the Ukrainians in order to protect Ukraine. A different narrative would be we have to fight an incredibly destructive proxy war in Ukraine that is bad for Ukrainians in order to protect Taiwan.
Yeah.
And these are like very different stories for like what is going on.
I mean, both of these are these aren't decisions about peace, these are decisions about bargaining power, right? Everything we do, in some sense, there's lots of efforts each side can make to alter their bargaining power in this conflict and alter their actual bargaining power in future conflicts, both through actual investments and also through signaling. And that's a lot. That's how to explain a lot of what's going on. Is we're fighting a war now because we're thinking about all the future wars we want to avoid,
right?
Or more importantly, the future wars we know will be avoided, but we'll be in a stronger bargaining position. We'll get a better deal without violence than before.
Yeah, so I laid out just a second ago the kind of reputation, escalate, like the argument for escalation on the basis of trying to show how fierce you are from NATO's point of view. The interesting thing is, like, Russia internally could have a similar kind of argument where they're like, well, we deployed all of our troops to the border and threatened to go to war, and if we back down now, then people are just never going to take our threats seriously again. So we have to go to war, even if we think it's a mistake in this case, just in order to, like, again, convince people that we're willing to go to war in future cases so people don't laugh in our faces.
Yeah, that kind of face-saving, if it's about signaling reputation, can happen. I think it's maybe a little exaggerated, and all sides recognize this, and so finding ways that Russia can save face are sort of like a natural peace-building strategy.
Yeah.
But a special case of this is something political scientists call audience costs, which is that if we think that Putin would be deposed if he lost, then on the one hand, you might think, great, glad to see you go. On the other hand, that is an incentive for him to just keep fighting beyond where it makes any sense whatsoever. And so there's a certain logic to letting someone like Putin not lose completely and letting him save face in order to, and at paying the price of knowing that the regime will not change, but at least it will end the war.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure exactly what to take away from all of that, but I suppose that's that's natural at this stage of the situation. I think if we tried to tie it up more neatly than that, we would still be proven wrong by events in just a couple of weeks. So
I think it's a good example of how it's really useful. For me, I find it really useful to have this analytical frame and the five forces to sort of analyze the situation.
Yeah.
But despondent because even with all the information available, and even in retrospect, looking, afterwards, it'll be difficult to really say it was this.
Yeah.
And so you have to be comfortable with the degree of uncertainty and ambiguity and like what we know. The good thing is at least it's a little bit more organized than the messy way, I was thinking about it before.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I just take away, which you already know, but it's like always good to be chastened by events, is just how hard it is to predict the future.
Yeah.
That I talked earlier about like my estimation of the military situation as if I had put thought into it, as if I had like actually analyzed it or collected any information. But it's not even at that level. I just kind of assumed that Russia was like in a far stronger military position.
I mean, as if either of us could have found Ukraine on an unlabeled map 5 months ago. Right. So we're all, I hope I've maybe stressed that in some way that this is, I know enough to be dangerous, as most of us do.
Yeah.
But I guess the way I justify this is I think there's some use. There's a lot of use in bringing these lessons from dozens and dozens and dozens of other wars to try to organize what people talk about. So rather than sort of say this is what I think is going on, again try to do this thing of just sort of classifying and organizing the way people are talking about it. And then of course I shoot my mouth off about what I think will happen, and I'm often mispredict. So, but
yeah,
hopefully not too terribly.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I could. My performance could rise to the level of me being wrong because of something I thought about a lot, because of something I didn't even think about at all. I mean, this is a part of the book actually that we won't get to talk about very much. But you have this observation that we tend to be very cautious and circumspect about our opinions about things that are closer to us because we understand the details and the difficulties, and then we're more confident about things the further away they are precisely because we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, a lot of ill is done in the world by having people go and be in charge of policy in a place they're not familiar with.
Yeah.
Which could be in their own city.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think? So before being too humble, do you think that if you were combined with someone who knew a ton about the specific Ukraine-Russia situation, that you would be able to add value because of the frameworks that you bring to thinking about these things? Like you might be able to structure their thinking somewhat better than they might if they're just someone who, follows politics in that region.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, yes. I mean, only because I think just not knowing much about Ukraine, but having a lot of practice at helping people analytically organize arguments and think and remind people of strategic incentives, I do add value. Like I blog, I blog and tweet and write articles a lot, and I avoid things when I'm just too unknowledgeable. But I feel totally comfortable doing this, not because I am the specialist, but just because there's not enough people calling attention to these psychological and strategic logics. Now, it would be even better if I knew something about it, but here we are.
Yeah, we can only know so much. Let's turn to what practical lessons we can potentially take away from all of the above kind of political science thinking. Mm-hmm. So I'm involved in the effective altruism and long-termist research communities. And in those groups, we have this special desire to reduce the probability of a great power war because we think that's the kind of war that could have really big and persistent effects that could make the future worse for many generations, even lead to extinction. And for more or less the same reason, we're particularly concerned about the use of nuclear weapons or other unconventional arms, such as bioweapons or cyber attacks, and also future technologies that could be particularly destructive, such as, weaponized AI.
Yeah.
And I guess actually something we haven't talked about much on the show, but is interesting and hopefully will come up in future, is that there's this fear that an AI that's programmed to engage in retaliation or to use blackmail or to engage in random escalation for strategic reasons, for kind of all of the game theory things that we've been talking about, that could be disastrous one way or another in its interactions with people or other AIs. I guess both if it's programmed to do that really well, and also if it's programmed to do that very poorly, or at least it does it in a way that's inconsistent with the way that other actors on Earth behave. Anyway, setting that aside, the problem that we face is that kind of having identified that the above is really important, we find it really hard to find projects that one can engage in that might actually move the needle on any of them. So it's like, war with China is bad. Yeah. Okay, so now what does that imply? It's kind of not obvious. Now, your expertise is kind of maybe more on the civil war side rather than great power wars. But I'm particularly keen to ask you a whole lot about this because I expect other podcast hosts won't be as aggressive about talking about great power conflicts. Yeah, to start off with, are the drivers of great power conflicts different on average than the drivers of smaller wars, as far as you can tell?
So a lot of the things that occur to me are questions of scale and difficulty of addressing in a short time frame rather than fundamental theoretical differences in like what the diagnosis is. Well, partly because every war is its own little unique flower, right? And there's snowflake, and so you have to diagnose each time. I think, if anything, there's a common set of very difficult to resolve roots to great power wars, which is that in a city, we can imagine a superstructure, a criminal superstructure organizing the gangs and being that third-party guarantor of peace and security and commitment and punishing unchecked leaders and solving the 5 problems. And at a city or even a national level, states perform those functions pretty well. And we've proven pretty good at constructing those institutions. And as an individual, if I decided I wanted to really make a contribution to those, I could probably make a difference on the margin. On the other hand, it's very hard for anybody, even the US president, to think, how could we change the fundamental structure of the UN Security Council?
Yeah.
And so there's a scale of human institutions where we don't yet have the solutions, and they're so big and slow and subject to lots of forces and competing actors that they're hard to manipulate. So there's this fundamental problem of anarchy, meaning there's nobody above to sort of settle these disputes and resolve these 5 problems. And there's a difficulty of tackling that.
Yeah.
We still have tools, but we just have to be
realistic.
Yeah, we have to be willing to work on these low return margins.
Yeah, one benefit that we have with great power conflicts, at least compared to civil wars, is that very often when you're ending a civil war, you're asking one or both sides to disarm. Yeah. And that creates this very thorny commitment problem where
absolutely true.
If you've been fighting a war and now you're going to give away all of your weapons, you're leaving yourself extremely vulnerable to the other side then retaliating against you once you've given up your power within the bargaining situation. And that kind of doesn't happen within great power conflicts these days. Like no one really thinks that US is trying to colonize all of China or vice versa.
That's true. And that makes great power wars easier to end than civil wars.
Yeah. I guess you might think that at the higher the scale, the more it's the case that personal idiosyncrasies would be kind of cancelled out, or like that a huge bureaucracy in a country as large as the US or China or Russia wouldn't allow one person's tastes and emotions to guide things.
If only, right? I mean, it is an amazing and unfortunate feat just how much Putin was able to personalize power, especially in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And it's something that Xi Jinping is apparently attempting to do. This is another country I'm not by any means an expert on, but an attempt to sort of further centralize and personalize power in China seems to be underway, and that too would make us the world a less stable place. That's not true. China is right now very institutionalized, very widely shared amongst many actors. So it is a very checked leadership by the standards of an autocracy. But that worries me most of all of the current global shifts.
That's decreasing over time.
Seems to be, or there's an attempt, and he could be quite successful.
Yeah. So, we really worry about centralization of power within China and Russia. But something that really stands out to me is, so the US used to have a norm, like it's like maybe more worth talking about countries in which listeners actually live because they actually have some potential to shift things. It used to be the case that in the US, you needed Congress's approval to declare war on another country. That has just kind of disappeared because seemingly Congress doesn't want the responsibility of declaring war. They don't like intervening in foreign policy because then they can be blamed when things go wrong. So they've just kind of delegated power to the president with almost like unlimited authority to do things militarily and in terms of foreign policy. And I really do wonder whether it wouldn't be better if we could somehow find a way to bring Congress back into the picture of deciding whether the United States goes to war, at least like wars of discretion.
Yeah, I mean, I think some more leeway has been given to the executive in the United States. I wouldn't go so far as to say they've completely given up that power. I agree that's worrisome. The U.S. is the one country that has probably taken decentralization a little bit too far. Maybe not from a conflict perspective, but from a just
in
capacity to get anything done. Yeah. So people, I have colleagues who have thought a lot about this and sort of think the U.S. needs to be a little bit more executive, a little more centralized. That would be fine. From my perspective, that's not the thing most countries in the world, even advanced democracies, have to worry about. Even Canada, where I grew up, is a surprisingly unchecked place, at least by formal political institutions, in that you have a very weak upper house that's appointed, and so you have really just a single legislature, and if you get a majority in parliament, then as a prime minister, you have an enormous amount of power, and there's no filibusters, so it's still a pretty federal place, so it's not totally unchecked, but it's actually, it's a little bit surprising to me how stable Canada is given that. And the only way I sort of explain it to myself, so it's a hypothesis, is that I think the informal institutions, informal checks and balances, what people are willing to tolerate, are really, really powerful in Canada. So it's all these hidden institutions that check the power of the executive, or not in this case, but the prime minister and a majoritarian party. So there's lots of ways to check power is one lesson, but I do think we'd be a safer world if even the more advanced democracies were a little bit more checked.
Yeah. So of the 5 factors, another one that I can make an argument that it might not loom as large in the great power or nuclear war situations is uncertainty. Because the US, China, Russia, they have such advanced espionage capabilities, such impressive satellites, plus also just lots of things are public about the military power of countries that are not, say, about the power of a gang.
Yeah.
That arguably there's less need to engage, or bluffing is less plausible because the other side can just see whether you have the aircraft carriers or not. And maybe that helps us.
There's an element of that. I mean, at the same time, I think we manage, and our policymakers and our presidents manage to have, I think, really oversimplified views of what's going on in these other countries. I think we can all imagine what those are when the oversimplified views Americans hold of Russia and China. One of the things I've heard about Russia is the extent to which the political class and this inner circle around Putin really bought into the rhetoric that the U.S. is polarized, going to have a civil war. You heard a lot of American press in the last year on the likelihood of an American civil war.
Yeah.
And I wrote a little bit about how the danger of overestimating that risk and the paranoid and I think alarmist stuff that was going around was that the danger was that other world leaders might start to believe it, even though it's false, because it's kind of in their interests. And so they think the U.S. is weak, ununified, time to make a gamble for Ukraine or something else, or time to make a gamble for Taiwan.
Right. Yeah, I suppose, Taiwan's a good example where the US has kind of decided to take the bluffing approach, which may or may not be the right idea. But China doesn't know, and I guess maybe even the US doesn't know whether it would defend Taiwan. It seems like we're kind of going to roll the dice if the time ever comes.
Yeah, I don't know how to think about what the right thing to do there is. I again, from this perspective of strategic empathy, I try to look at this from China's perspective, and I say, well, what if after the end of the U.S. Civil War, the Confederacy had gone down and occupied the Florida Keys, and it just wasn't worth or possible to exterminate them. And so now in southern Florida, there was still, and maybe it's not even a slave state any longer, right? So they're not repugnant, but maybe it's a repugnant system to us, or a threatening system. But even if that's not true, there's no world in which Americans are like, yeah, that's a legitimate political entity. You're like, no, they lost. They're totally legitimate, and they need to go, and the Florida Keys are ours. And I'd be super sympathetic to that. And so I can see how the Chinese regard this. And so it's a dangerous game. And at the same time, the thing that we're standing up for in Taiwan is, I think, very noble, which is democracy and liberty. So it's really hard.
Yeah, one of the interventions you discuss in the book that doesn't seem that applicable to preventing great power wars is kind of sending in peacekeeping forces.
Yeah. Totally inapplicable, yeah.
Yeah. Another one that's difficult to use, is having overarching set of rules to police state behavior. And the issue there is...
That could work. We do have rules. The International Criminal Court is a great example of an attempt to build in a set of impartial rules that no one nation controls. And it's actually potentially strong and capable enough and impartial enough that that's the main reason the U.S. is one of the only countries that's not a signatory.
I see.
So it is a little bit rich right now for Biden to be recommending an International Criminal Court proceedings against Putin when the U.S. has refused to sign on. So I think it's possible to create impartial rules.
But I mean, I guess the fact that the US doesn't sign up is kind of a sign of how it's challenging once you're a powerful enough country.
Yeah, although it's been working reasonably well in spite of that. And I can imagine a world where they do sign on at some point. Likewise, you can imagine more, like right now, the sanctions reaction, the sanctions unity and regime towards Russia is super selective and I don't want to call it hypocritical, but it's in the West's interests. We're using it to punish or deter one invasion and one set of actions. Like there's all sorts of worse things that have happened in the last 20 years where we didn't do that. And there have been times when the US has gone and invaded other countries and evaded any set of sanctions rules that were more impartial, that punished any power, great or small, for such a thing would deter peace. And I think that's not inconceivable.
Yeah. Okay, so I suppose, yeah, it is possible to create structures that partially constrain great powers, I guess, or at least like that raise the costs of bad behavior for them, even if it doesn't actually prevent them from doing those things.
Yeah.
That's the basic idea, yeah. And I guess, and maybe you have this issue that you can sign treaties that you could then get bound to, like, and even if later on you don't like it, you're still kind of stuck with it.
Absolutely. I mean, Elinor Ostrom, who I talk about in the book, and Amos Sawyer, a Liberian political scientist who I talk in the book, talk about something called polycentric governance, which is one way of saying decentralized governance, but not just decentralized across branches of government or decentralized downwards, but supranational governance. So international treaties. Every time we create a set of international treaties and agreements that do bind us and do come with penalties attached if we abrogate them, then that does bind the hands. That's another way to check rulers.
Yeah. Are there any kind of particular interventions to reduce the risk of great power wars that jump out as like more relevant than the others?
Yeah, great power wars are the thorniest because it's very difficult to distinguish a intervention institution that's done to pacify the situation from one that's just trying to elevate the bargaining power of one side. So the only way to think about it is like, if you have two great powers in conflict, what can the third great power, if neutral, do to mitigate the risk of conflict? There, I think there are some tools, but otherwise, everything you do is really just a weapon of war or a weapon of competition.
Right. So is this kind of offsetting issue that I was talking about earlier?
What would I think? I haven't thought this through, so I have to I don't know. I mean, imagine there's a great power war brewing between Russia and China. That's not happening, but there's some, or Russia and India. I mean, or China and India, I should say. I mean, what can you do as a third party to deter that? Well, I think you could go and you could tell is that any aggressive actions, any first movers, we are going to punish with sanctions. You could try to use what tools you have. You could also try to mediate, right? Which they would. So this is what Israel and Turkey are trying to do in the context of Russia and Ukraine is take a very costly stance, which is to maintain impartiality and try to help these two sides bargain. And so a third great power could do this. But unless there's some third powerful party, even if it's not an overpowerful party, but unless there's some third powerful party that can do these things, then there aren't any options.
Because no one has the resources to meaningfully shift the incentives.
Right. Or you need to construct this international architecture that constrains everybody.
Right.
Or at least constrains the great powers.
Does that make it, I suppose, so you have like a bunch of very powerful countries, but you could have an alliance of smaller countries that then might be able to act as if it was a larger country. But I suppose doing that is kind of just adding another great power to the mix. Yeah. And then it's like now you've got like an even more multipolar world, which sounds worse potentially.
I mean, I think like we talked about how it cuts both ways, but I do think that ideas of universal human rights and brotherhood and sisterhood is pacifying in the sense that we have sympathy for others, and so we're less likely to go to war about them. I think the economic entanglements we have through trade are very protective. So I think untethering ourselves from the Chinese economy too much or too rapidly is not stabilizing. Yeah. Even if it achieves other national goals, that's something Americans can vote on and decide on. Yeah, entangling China in our lives as much as possible through immigration and trade and social exchange and watching their television shows and making sure they get some Netflix or something are all going to, on the margin, I think, help a bit. They're not like magic solutions.
Yeah.
That strikes me as very important.
Yeah, the like entangling economies and cultures and people is one of the interventions that you talk about a bunch in the book. I mean, that's one that I was very optimistic about back in 2015. Yeah. And then it seems it's one where people have noticed that the entanglement does reduce, or like maybe it does make war less likely, but it also makes you vulnerable to the other side. It also like potentially weakens your position against them. At least if you're, buying military equipment from them or something like that. There's some that have a greater problem there than others.
Yeah, it's complicated. So yeah, there's some countervailing effects, like you say. Like maybe, but why is India not united with the West on this? Well, there's lots of reasons, but one reason is they depend on Russian military equipment for their entire military apparatus, et cetera, et cetera. But I think on average, it's pacifying.
Okay.
But people also have had a tendency to exaggerate this in history. There's lots of Enlightenment thinkers saying, the trade is and liberty is going and human rights are going to extirpate war forever. And that didn't happen. But that doesn't mean it's not like an on-off switch. It can still be helpful.
Yeah. Are there any interventions that stand out to you in the context of preventing a major nuclear war?
I mean, I think these arms reduction treaties and any effort and the invention of these International Atomic Energy Association to like monitor these things is maybe one of the most powerful things we can do to sort of systematically disarm. I think anything that improves the quality and rapidity of communications between world leaders are all things that we've been doing. What we would do further, I think maybe that just gets beyond, I'm not sure I have a good idea. It's not something I know very well.
It seems like in the past, conflicts between or within smaller countries have sometimes prompted larger countries to end up fighting because they start a proxy war there and then that potentially escalates. I guess one thing you could take away from that is that, actually like preventing smaller scale conflicts is also potentially useful in terms of preventing great power wars because they can escalate. I guess your model could also suggest that, it's an illusion that the war in the smaller country was actually causing the war, the war between great powers. That just was the proximal cause, but not the deep underlying cause. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm trying to think of a concrete example. I mean, you might think of World War I as an example where there's this Balkan conflict, but there, I think it's more of an example of what you said, which is that there's actually a fundamental strategic challenge there presented by Russia's rise, and Germany merely needed an excuse. So I guess most cases that would be my suspicion that these proxy wars escalate to larger wars partly because there were fundamental disagreements rather than just some natural escalatory dynamic that can mechanically happen. I think I'm more skeptical about that.
Yeah. I guess another case that is in the book is the 7 Years' War, where you describe the provocations by the Americans as potentially prompting that. But I imagine if there wasn't other reasons that they would have found a way to avoid that.
I think so. I actually don't know I don't know enough about what was happening on the European side. I suspect the flare up in these little interior forts between the French and the American colonists was maybe not it's like a trigger in the same sense that like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was a trigger, but I don't know if it was I doubt it was the whole thing.
Yeah. I guess I mentioned earlier a way in which perversely electing a leader who's extremely oriented towards peace could potentially not make things safer. But it seems like if every country has leaders who are deeply committed to peace, to whom war is repugnant, that does lower the risk of war because both sides would be willing to concede more rather than fight. And so you're expanding the range of deals that they think are better than war.
I mean, any generalized notion of like human rights and the value of human life and the value of the other stranger is going to be pacifying so long as everybody
believes it,
possesses it. It might even be pacifying if I'd have to think about it more. It might even be pacifying if only some people do it. It would reduce your bargaining power.
Yeah.
In the sense because you're not going to be willing to use war. Anything that makes war more costly to you, but not to your enemy, is going to expand the bargaining range in ways that are disadvantageous to you. And that's like a real key. Whenever we think of things, you have to sort of think about, is this something that's elevating the risk of war, or is this something that's just changing relative bargaining power? And they're distinct things. And a lot of things that we think, like a lot of people say, well, what about doesn't counterinsurgency tactics cause war? And new technologies, new military technologies cause war? And I'm like, no, that's just relative bargaining power. And then you have to rebargain.
Well, new technologies create uncertainty. So there's that channel.
There could be that. I agree. But they're principally shifting bargaining power.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, do you have any other examples of things that people think might help in this context, but it's ambiguous or they don't help?
So, let me use an example from cities who want to reduce violence, say intergroup violence between gangs or interpersonal violence between individuals. There's often a sense, we need to in Chicago, they're like, we need to economically develop the South Side. And I've been on radio programs in Chicago and people are saying, well, you're doing this, but what we really need are jobs. And that doesn't make sense to me for a few reasons. Number one, for reasons we talked about earlier, making the pie larger or smaller doesn't change the fundamental calculus. So the fact that these gang members have jobs available might not change the fact that there's whatever they're fundamentally competing against. But what's more important, we could debate that. What's more important is just that it's totally untargeted, right? Chicago's violence problem is 2,000 or 3,000 people. And so any strategy directed towards 500,000 people, especially a jobs creation program that is probably never going to reach any of these extreme people, is a bad idea. So what's the analogy in the international arena? It's any sort of generic foreign aid that we give to poor countries that's not actually specifically targeting the roots of violence and the diagnosis of what's going on there. But it has this sort of generic, poorly thought through feel of let's just sort of help Africa get richer and then there'll be less war. And it's probably not true. It might be good to do that for other reasons, but that's probably not going to reduce violence. So you really have to be targeted. And I think that's the lesson from cities to nations, is that you have to really think about who are the violent actors and decision makers and focus on them.
Yeah. I suppose, one thing that you have a section about how it seems like offering cognitive behavioral therapy to kind of at-risk youth in that sort of context can significantly reduce the probability that they engage in murder, which is very cool. And I was thinking in the great power context, being, can we pay Joe Biden to go and get CBT therapy, or how much would you have to pay Xi Jinping to go to a course? I actually think even if you could do that, I'm not sure that it would help, because that's the context where these decisions are not made in the heat of the moment in the same way that gang shootings are.
I think you're right. So I think a lot of CBT around violence is doing a few things. One of the things is it's trying to help you cope with that hot reactive violence.
Yeah.
And that's not the thing that we think is driving a lot of wars. Maybe personalized dictators. But the other thing it's doing is a lot of CBT, and this includes CBT, like basic marriage counseling, is all of these misperceptions, these availability bias, these projection bias, these hard, rigid, poisonous views that we have of our adversary, our tendency to interpret their actions in the worst light possible, almost automatically, without really, and having an inability to see it from their shoes or have any strategic empathy. Those are really, really, really common problems of interpersonal conflict as well. So it's not just passions. And so that is what CBT is really good at helping people get over.
Right. Yeah, we're actually kind of recapitulating a bunch of stuff that I discussed with Robert Wright last year, where he has this movement where he's trying to promote peace and reduce conflict, which involves kind of getting everyone to slow down and meditate and do CBT and so on. And I was like, seems very scattershot. Like most people aren't going to war anyway. Encouraging all of the, someone random to go and do CBT doesn't seem like it helps. And I was like, what about targeting it on the State Department? Get everyone in the State Department to do a CBT course or what do you call it? Perspective taking.
Yeah,
practice.
Perspective taking. Yeah.
And I was like, that seems more targeted and more useful to me.
That's what we call effective bureaucratic design, especially in in a diplomatic organization. You want people in the State Department and National Security Council to be really, really, really good at perspective taking, strategic empathy. Yeah, really, really good at recognizing their biases. That's creating an institutional culture, and you want them to question bad information and rather than punish them for it. Right. So there's some principles of organizational design that I think are really important, that are less about CBT
and more about rational analysis, improving the analysis.
Yeah, and just avoiding some of the problems of some of the group dysfunctions.
Yeah, I think it will be hard to pitch that to, for example, the State Department on the basis that it's pacifying, but it could be possible to pitch it on the basis that it improves the quality of the recommendations because you understand the other side better. It allows you to actually get more of the pie.
I mean, I think there are, and I actually go further, I think many of our national security leaders are very aware of this, and they deliberately design practices. So they have things like red teams whose their job is to like take down the analysis. I think President Obama in particular was known for, and even George W. Bush as well, like sort of going around the room and sort of like, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Before consciously not telling people what they think ahead of time to not bias. They wanted to sort of get that less varnished opinions. And so there are lots of things as a leader, as an organization, you can do and institutionalize to reduce this. And I think actually a lot of our national security apparatuses in every country are pretty good at that.
Yeah.
That's maybe what my colleague thinks has fallen apart in this insulated personalized dictatorship in Russia.
Yeah. So over the last few months, I've had some people get quite angry with me when I've tried to explain what I like Putin's motivations using this kind of rationalist strategic analysis. And, my goal is to say, no, this is good. It's like, it's good to do this. You have to set your passions aside. You have to set your moral convictions aside and aim for understanding. But like, I'm at risk of losing my moral compass, or like both of us are at risk of losing our moral compass sometimes and becoming too compromising. And indeed, I guess, could it weaken your strategic bargaining position if you become too sympathetic to the other side through this method of trying to understand them better?
I guess if you believe, if your intangible incentive is we have to punish wrongdoers, and
then people who don't share that and putting themselves in a mindset of not sharing that.
Yeah. Punishing wrongdoers no matter what is a little bit like this intransigence that will probably, continue the current fight and then maybe increase our bargaining power in future. It would be fine if people were doing that in a considered way. I do think listen, if those same people were getting just as mad over Xinjiang and getting just as mad over 12 other things, and if they could tell me about the horrible things that are going on in Ethiopia, if they were internally consistent, that would be a lot more credible. But if it's when it's an ally, and if it's an ally in Europe, and it's an ally who has the same skin color as me, and all of these other things that make us a little bit more prone to get mad about this human rights abuse and not others, I think we need to be very suspicious of it. And sadly, I have yet to talk to one of these people who feels so strongly that can even tell me the first thing about what's been going on in Ethiopia for a year and a half. And so I think I'm right to be suspicious of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I have somewhat tracked what's going on in Ethiopia. It's an interesting case where it might actually be much easier for us to lean on Ethiopia because they're more of an ally. That there's more, and much less powerful than Putin. And so you actually do a lot more good in terms of human rights, potentially by creating strong incentives for groups that want to be aligned with you.
Yeah, or, I know a little bit, and I know some people who know a lot, and the alternative is that the U.S. government could actually have fumbled and done the opposite by giving too much support to the Abiy regime and demonizing the Tigrayans too much. Neither side is acting particularly well, but I do think there's a way in which we look back on this, and where one of the things that led to this conflict was the U.S. government actually not making a concerted effort to help these parties find agreement.
Yeah.
And maybe even doing things that are counterproductive.
Yeah. An audience member wanted to ask your views on democratic peace theory. I haven't spent much time on that because it seems like our ability to change whether great powers are democracies or not is somewhat limited. So it's not clear what the intervention is. But yeah, what do you think of, how large do you think the effect is of being a democracy on reducing your warlikeness?
So this is an area where I think that the theory and a lot of the casual empirics are really strong, and then the hard tests are pretty rare and or difficult to believe fully. But I'm partly convinced on the basis of the idea in the case. And it goes back to this broader point about over-centralized power being the root of accentuating all five kinds of conflict. It mechanically is going to make leaders more unchecked and less likely to internalize costs, but it means we're at the mercy of their misperceptions, we're at the mercy of their intangible incentives, there's more uncertainty, they can't commit. And so it just aggravates all these sources of war. And I think that is, to me, a very plausible rationale for why highly checked and balanced societies very seldom go to war against anyone or against one another. And when they do go to war, it's usually against a relatively unchecked society where they can't find a mutual bargaining range. But I'm careful to sort of talk in the book about these sort of checked and balanced societies rather than democratic, because democratic, people think means that, most people just leap to thinking is the president elected or not.
Yeah.
But then there's a lot of countries like Liberia where you're electing a dictator every 5 years. That's a slight exaggeration, but they're not that checked and balanced. They have a lot of autonomy. And so an election for the executive is actually not the most important check from my perspective for peace building. It's actually the division of power within the country across branches of government, across levels of government in the country, and to these like supranational organizations. So anything that does that is going to make things more peaceable. So I totally buy democratic peace theory, but the idea that it's just like some simple, if we all had elections for president, we'd have a peaceful world, that's not true.
Yeah, I think people talk about kind of thick and narrow conceptions of democracy. And I used to think that the people who were trying to use a thick definition of democracy were like slightly cheating, but they just define everything that they like as democracy and call it that. And
that happens too.
I think there's something to that, which is like anything that is good is democracy and anything that isn't. But I think like I've come to think that the thick conception of democracy where it's like spread out power, like people have more information is actually the more useful concept than the narrow one where it's just like, do people vote at some point?
Right. I mean, that's why I think China is a relatively stable place. It's not democratic, but it's a relatively checked and balanced place.
Yeah.
Could be more, of course, and that would make the world a safer place.
I've heard a decent amount of skepticism about democratic peace theory. And kind of the argument goes that democracies like the US, it's not that they don't engage in wars, it's that they engage in wars that they can win because they have better decision-making apparatus. They're less likely to make massive mistakes, but nonetheless, they have interests. They're in conflict with other countries, and sometimes they end up fighting them and winning them and getting the thing that they can get. And also, the US isn't at war with Venezuela, but it's engaging in awfully crushing sanctions that kill a lot of people. And it seems kind of like war, right? It seems like borderline war. And they're doing that because they can get away with it and it's in their interests. So there could be a kind of whole lot of quasi-war behavior that democracies engage in, or like brief wars, or like intimidation where the other side is stood down on the basis of threats of violence that are going on that kind of aren't getting counted here?
Well, I mean, so I would say, listen, strenuous hostile competition and the wielding of hard and soft power in order to obtain objectives using every means necessary other than armed invasion is totally normal. And what distinguishes that from most war, in one sense, is, other than the explicit use of armed violence, is the fact that it's like the whole thing that made war not happen, or most kinds of war violence not happen, was that it was super costly and there was a better way. It's not clear that there's a better alternative to these other tools that democracies and other countries wield in order. So I'm not saying that democracies don't pursue their own interests, that they're not self-interested. I'm suggesting that they mostly, because their power is checked and balanced, they don't engage in activities to attain what they want that are really, really costly to their own people.
Yeah.
So that doesn't rule out bad behavior. So if we want to say, well, is there like democratic harmony? No, I don't believe in democratic harmony, right? I believe in democratic peace in the sense of they're far less likely to actually go to have this highly inefficient thing called warfare.
Yeah. I mean, this kind of raises an interesting conceptual point that the reason we expect countries not to go to war is that it does a lot of harm, like a lot of people suffer enormously. But now let's look at the US sanctions against Venezuela. It's like potentially many more Venezuelans are dying due to the sanctions than might die if there was a full-on invasion.
Yeah. I mean, in this strategic story we're telling, you don't care about cost the other side of your actions.
But I mean, well, it is costly to the US because they can't buy Venezuelan oil, right? So
I'd say it's not particularly costly. If Venezuela had a monopoly on oil, that would be true, and we would not be having sanctions on them.
Right.
And the supply, the elasticity of supply of oil is pretty high, and so
I see.
So it's true. There's some people paying. There's all these refineries in the southern U.S. that were built to sort of process Venezuelan oil, and they're kind of running silent, or not running, and so there's costs to pay. But we're, Americans are not bearing the burden of these sanctions.
I see. So in the accountability story, the point is that they haven't gone to war in a way that would harm the United States because it's a democracy and leaders would lose if that happened. But it's totally consistent with the story for them to harm people in other countries because Venezuelans don't get a vote.
Yeah, and we're quite willing to sort of support conflicts like many aspects of the drug war if we can export some of the costs as well. Or that's true of any group. So we might have a very different, drug policy if we had to face some of the consequences that Mexico and Colombia have to face.
Yeah. A slightly facetious question. back in history, kind of during 14th, 15th, 16th century, my understanding is that countries would sometimes effectively exchange hostages, that exchange members of the nobility in order to make it more costly to declare war on the other country, because then the hostages would be killed, or at least would be at risk.
Yeah. They would also marry each other's children to one another,
right.
which is another kind of hostage taking, according probably the eyes of some of these princesses
of
and
the
princes,
people who were married off. Yeah. I'm not sure that they were getting a vote on that. It doesn't seem like we've come up with an amazing list of things that I feel like we can fund in order to stop the risk of war between China and the US. But given that both sides in that conflict would regard it as catastrophic to have a war, I imagine, is there
building all our iPhone? I'd rather, if you said, do we want like five Chinese hostages, or all of our iPhones get built in China, then I'd take the iPhones.
Yeah. So that's the interdependence argument.
Right. So I think that's part. That's what the marriage and the hostages were just trying. Well, they're not the hostages. That's what the marriages were trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, so we wouldn't actually do hostages now, but you could have an agreement where it's like many very important people from both countries go and live in like the capital city of the other country. So effectively, they're in the firing line if things go wrong.
Right. I don't know how exactly this works, but the fact that the U.S. holds the gold reserves of many countries is maybe a little bit like hostages as well. I'm not sure how that works legally, but the fact we're all a little bit more interested in this now that they seem to hold all of Afghanistan's money.
Yeah.
So that is a tool of leverage.
Yeah. So the US is trying to disentangle itself from the Chinese economy to some degree. And I guess it seems like China is kind of disentangling itself in some ways from the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have any comments on trade policy here? Are you like against that on balance because it could make the risk of war higher?
Yeah, I don't actually know how much of it is actually happening, or if it's just like decreasing a trend. So I don't know the numbers. I'm sympathetic to the idea that I think the US has a lot of domestic political problems and inequality because, globalist elites like me rushed very quickly to seek a more integrated world economy, and there were winners and losers, and then we forgot to compensate the losers. So that's the source of a lot of political ills in the country right now, to some degree. And so addressing that is just smart, stable domestic politics. I have to think that can be balanced against the desire to remain entangled with China. And frankly, I'm not that worried. I mean, I feel like the incentives to remain entangled are so high. I'm not super worried of like a huge rollback.
I see. Yeah.
Maybe I should be, but
I guess, yeah, to wrap up, there is this kind of controversy among people who I read about how optimistic we should be about war having been reduced over the last 70 years and what are our prospects of a major war over the next 100 years. Steven Pinker famously kind of is fairly optimistic about this, takes a fairly positive tone. Bear Bramolo, we're talking about, wrote this book kind of arguing back saying, no, it's like the dynamics that cause wars to start and escalate really haven't changed so much. They're like both really smart people who I respect who have like some statistics on their side. Where do you kind of come down on this?
I mean, of course, in the middle. That's where I've come down on a lot of these things. I mean, I lean a little bit. I do think like our architecture, institutionally, and a lot of things that Pinker talks about, states and norms and humanitarian revolution, I do think those have moved the needle a lot.
Yeah.
And so I think the destructive power of our weapons have contributed to that. But I don't share like an unadulterated optimism that like I think the warnings from someone like Bear and many others are like absolutely correct, that we can be like a little bit safer than we were in the 20th century, but the 20th century had some pretty bad moments, so we shouldn't be complacent.
Yeah, it makes sense. All right. Yeah, we've already gone over time, so I should let you go. Yeah, I guess to wrap up, I'm left a little bit here, a bit unsure exactly what I would want to fund, or what the career implications of all of this might be. Although I think it's really going to help the audience think a lot more clearly about these war and conflict issues going forward. Do you have any like more concrete suggestions for what listeners could take away in terms of actions that they could take?
Sure. I mean, partly, this is something I grappled with myself, and I guess I get up every day and work on this because I think it's possible to chip away in the margin. And I kind of wrote a whole chapter, but that's the way I wanted to end the book. I wanted to end the book in a concrete way as well. So rather than just have like everything's getting better, I was like, okay, here's how to operate better. One thing that I think I'm trying to do, but I think a lot of people can do, is I think it's really important to change the conversation. I think it's possible for individuals to shape how people think about and talk about conflict. And that can be in their city. very easily. That could be internationally. I do think a lone voice in Congress, even if it's an aide who sort of reminds people that this is costly and not the natural thing, or reminds people of some strategic dynamic or some psychological factor, or somebody who makes the State Department just be a little bit more accountable, a little bit more aware of biases, that would be a huge contribution. I think individuals can do that kind of thing all the time. So you can change conversations, and you can do that in any field. You can change the conversation in poverty alleviation. You can change the conversation in public health. And partly because it's actually worrisome how easy it is to change the conversation, but because I think it's unsettled. I mean, then the question is like, how do you get there? That's kind of the thing that happens in a lot of my office hours. People are like, okay, now I want to do this. Like, what are like the concrete steps that I take? And, if it's the first person is most people don't really think about knocking on the doors that nobody else knocks on. So if I wanted to like actually change the conversation or change the mind of somebody, honestly, if I were 22 right now, I would just start emailing deputy ministers in 24 countries, trying to like middle and low income countries where I could operate in the languages I know, just to be their like aid, right? Because they don't have a lot of human capital and nobody ever emails them to sort of say, everybody's applying to whatever UN internship or something like that, right? But nobody's reaching out to these people, or nobody's going and saying, there's dozens of cities on the planet where no one knocks on those doors. And I think you could make a real difference just by bringing, if you're a Western person, I think you're just bringing a certain sort of style of thinking and a level of education, level of human capital that is partly there, but not fully there. And that's kind of like the theme through a lot of what I do is I kind of why don't I not work in Russia? I'm like, everybody else is working in Russia. Nobody is figuring out organized crime in Colombia, as far as I can tell. So I'm going to work there. I'm going to be the first person, or maybe not the first, but I'm going to be one of a very small group of people who are chipping away at these problems to change that conversation. And and I think that's been hugely effective.
My guest today has been Christopher Blattman. Thanks so much for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Christopher.
Thank you.
Okay, just before we go, I also wanted to plug another new book out this week by a former guest and friend of the show, AJ Jacobs. That book is called The Puzzler, and in it, AJ goes on a journey through the world of puzzles, exploring why we love them, what they do to our brains, and how they can potentially help to improve the world. You can hear him talk a whole bunch about that book at the start of his episode on the show, which was episode 79, AJ Jacobs on radical honesty, following the whole Bible, and reframing global problems as puzzles. Kieran read an advanced copy of it and is willing to put his reputation on the line to say that it is a really wonderful book. You can find a link to buy it if you're interested in the blog post for this episode. One other update, actually, from another previous guest and friend of the show, in this case, the academic Philip Tetlock, is that Phil is now launching a new forecasting tournament where they're pairing together experts on specific existential risks like pandemics, risks from AI, nuclear war, climate change, and so on. So they're pairing people who are very knowledgeable about those existential risks with people who are very knowledgeable about forecasting specifically to see whether a combination of those two different forms of expertise could produce better predictions about how the world is going to play out in future than either one of them individually. That research project is called the Hybrid Persuasion Forecasting Tournament, and they're currently recruiting a whole lot of people to participate, both as experts in forecasting and as experts in existential risks specifically. Philip says that kind of some key features of the program are having really carefully assembled collections of early warning indicators for risks, looking at the interplay between smart generalists and subject matter experts, and a measurement focused not only on forecasting accuracy, but also on the power of the explanations for forecasts to move other people's views, hopefully in the right direction. I think a lot of listeners to this show could potentially really be perfect to get involved in that. So we'll stick up a link to more information about the nature of the tournament and how you can apply to potentially be involved in the blog post associated with this episode. All right, the 80,000 Hours podcast is produced and edited by Kieran Harris, audio mastering and technical editing by Ben Cordell. Full transcripts and an extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together by Katie Moore. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.